The pink wheelchair sat completely empty in the middle of a neat suburban house, while the girl who had spent her entire life paralyzed inside it was currently walking down a highway, completely cured, entirely healthy, and completely on the run. On June 14, 2015, emergency responders in Springfield, Missouri, forced their way into a residence to find the blood-covered body of a mother who had sacrificed everything to care for her severely disabled, terminally ill daughter. Yet the complex medical equipment, the feeding tubes, and the heavy medication remained untouched, while the fragile teenager who supposedly needed them to survive had vanished without a trace. The initial panic over a helpless child being kidnapped by a predatory killer was instantly shattered by a single realization. The entire tragedy was built on a massive, decades-long lie. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand how a perfectly healthy young woman ended up trapped in a pink wheelchair, one must look closely at the meticulously constructed world of Claudinea D. Blanchard. Born in 1967 in Louisiana, D. grew up in a family that later described her as a deeply troubled, manipulative individual who routinely stole from relatives and exhibited unsettling behavioral patterns long before she became a mother. The illusion began in earnest in July 1991 with the birth of her daughter, Gypsy Rose, in Chackbay, Louisiana. Almost from the moment the child drew her first breath, D. began projecting a relentless stream of severe phantom illnesses onto her daughter, initiating a dynamic that would define the next 24 years of their lives. When Gypsy was merely an infant, her mother claimed the child suffered from sleep apnea, a condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep. This was only the first brick in an immense wall of medical fiction. As the girl grew into a toddler, a minor motorcycle accident involving her grandfather became the perfect pretext for a massive escalation. D. declared that her daughter had suffered internal injuries that permanently damaged her spine, rendering her completely incapable of walking. From that moment on, Gypsy was confined to a wheelchair, a physical constraint that served as the visual anchor for the entire deception. The medical rap sheet D. compiled for her daughter grew exponentially over the years, transforming a vibrant child into a walking textbook of catastrophic diagnoses. According to the medical records her mother managed to forge or extract from compliant physicians, Gypsy suffered from chromosomal defects, leukemia, muscular dystrophy, severe asthma, epilepsy, and profound hearing and vision impairments. To sustain this reality, D. subjected the young girl to a grueling, invasive routine of daily medical interventions. Gypsy's head was routinely shaved to mimic the appearance of a cancer patient undergoing aggressive chemotherapy. Her saliva glands were surgically removed because her mother convinced doctors that the girl drooled excessively due to neurological damage. A surgically implanted feeding tube, a gastrostomy button, became the primary conduit for her nutrition, bypassing her perfectly functional digestive system to pump a constant stream of heavy, sedating medications and thick formula directly into her stomach. The physical toll of this manufactured existence was brutal. Due to the unnecessary anti-seizure medications and dental neglect resulting from the removal of her salivary glands, Gypsy's teeth rotted away, eventually requiring the total extraction of her permanent teeth. She was forced to wear heavy, painful leg braces whenever she attempted to stand, and she was restricted to a strict diet of sugary nutritional supplements that further deteriorated her physical well-being. Throughout this entire process, D. maintained an ironclad grip on her daughter's perception of reality. She constantly reminded the girl that she had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old child, and that she could not survive without her mother's constant, hyper-vigilant care. Whenever they visited a new specialist, D. would do all the talking, weaving a seamless, highly emotional narrative of a devoted saint sacrificing her life for a terminally ill child. If a doctor began to express skepticism or order tests that might expose the lack of underlying pathology, D. would immediately pack their bags, alter the medical histories, and move on to a completely different hospital, ensuring that no single physician could ever look at the complete, fraudulent picture for too long. The physical isolation inside the home created a digital loophole that eventually cracked the foundation of the entire deception. As Gypsy grew into her early 20s, despite her mother fiercely maintaining to the public that the young woman possessed the intellect of a child, the internet became an unmonitored sanctuary. Hidden beneath the blankets late at night, away from her mother's hypervigilant glare, a cheap laptop computer became a portal to a world completely detached from surgical procedures and pharmaceutical regimens. The digital space allowed a severely abused young woman to test the boundaries of her own autonomy, seeking validation, connection, and normalcy through secret profiles on online dating forums. It was on a specialized Christian dating website in October 2012 that a digital connection was established with a 23-year-old man from Big Bend, Wisconsin, named Nicholas Godejohn. The initial exchange of messages quickly escalated into a deeply intense, multi-layered online relationship that spanned nearly 3 years. Through text messages, video calls, and secret late-night forums, a complex psychological symbiosis began to take shape. Nicholas, an individual with a history of profound mental health struggles, low cognitive functioning, and socially maladaptive behaviors, found an absolute purpose in protecting the fragile, high-pitched voice on the other end of the screen. For Gypsy, the young man was not a medical specialist or a charitable donor. He was a romantic partner who viewed her as a desirable adult woman, completely capable of a life outside a wheelchair. The relationship quickly developed a dark, highly compartmentalized architecture. To bypass the inevitable risk of maternal detection, the couple created distinct digital personas to explore their deepest impulses. They engaged in elaborate role-play scenarios, adopting alter egos that ranged from innocent fairy tale characters to intensely dark, violent personalities. Nicholas frequently channeled a protective, aggressive entity he referred to as his dark side, a persona that claimed to possess a ruthless capacity for violence if provoked. Gypsy, trapped in a continuous loop of physical and psychological trauma, found comfort in this perceived strength, gradually shifting the nature of their conversations from basic romantic flirting to a desperate strategy for absolute escape. The digital intimacy was briefly tested in the physical world in March 2015, during a highly orchestrated encounter at a local movie theater in Springfield. Dee Dee, completely unaware of the years of prior digital contact, had agreed to let her daughter attend a screening of a popular film. Nicholas had traveled all the way from Wisconsin, positioning himself in the same theater to facilitate a brief, heavily chaperoned meeting. The reality of the physical encounter was stark. The couple spent a brief moment together in the public restroom, attempting a hurried physical connection, while the mother sat just a few rows away in the dark theater. The severe anxiety of detection and the absolute impossibility of achieving any real freedom under the current arrangement solidified a terrifying conclusion in the young woman's mind. The maternal surveillance was too absolute. A conventional escape was an engineering impossibility. The digital correspondence in the months following the theater meeting took a definitive, calculated turn toward homicide. The prose in the text logs shifted away from standard romantic declarations, adopting a clinical, transactional tone focused entirely on logistics. The logistics involved coordinating travel dates, acquiring a weapon, and mapping out the precise layout of the Springfield home. Gypsy began sending detailed descriptions of her mother's deep sleep cycles, fueled by the heavy sedatives routinely kept in the house. Nicholas expressed an intense, obsessive readiness to deploy his alternative persona to eliminate the single obstacle standing between them and a shared future. The psychological boundary had been completely crossed. The digital escape plan had evolved into a deadly contract, waiting for the precise moment of execution. The digital blueprint transformed into physical reality on the evening of June 14, 2015. The geographic distance between the state of Wisconsin and the residential neighborhood in Springfield, Missouri, roughly 550 miles, was eliminated when Nicholas traveled by bus, carrying a concealment knife that had been specifically procured for the task. The physical coordination of the arrival was entirely managed through a sequence of encrypted text messages sent from within the house, where the unsuspecting mother had already retired to her bedroom for the night. The absolute quiet of the suburban home was broken only by the soft thud of the front door being unlocked from the inside. a deliberate act that signaled the complete breakdown of maternal control. The physical choreography of the assault was marked by a cold, transactional execution. Upon entering the residence, the young man was handed the blade, while the daughter retreated immediately to the confines of the adjoining bathroom. Inside the small enclosed space, she crouched on the linoleum floor, tightly pressing her palms against her ears to create a physical barrier against the impending sounds of violence. The auditory environment of the house shifted abruptly. A sudden, desperate struggle erupted in the master bedroom as the sleeping woman was violently awakened by the first physical blows. The assault was brutal, intimate, and highly concentrated. The perpetrator used his physical mass to pin the victim to the mattress, utilizing the heavy blade with repetitive downward motions. The lack of defensive wounds on the victim's hands suggested the attack was too swift and overwhelming to permit any real resistance. A total of 17 stab wounds were inflicted across the victim's back and neck, severing vital arteries and causing rapid, fatal exsanguination. The physical texture of the sheets, heavy with blood, and the metallic odor that quickly filled the enclosed room marked the absolute termination of the victim's life. Throughout the entire duration of the struggle, the individual in the bathroom remained completely motionless, waiting for the silence that would signify the completion of the deed. The immediate aftermath of the homicide was characterized by a bizarre mixture of panic and routine domestic cleanup. Once the struggle had concluded, the bedroom door was opened, and the perpetrator informed his partner that the task was finished. Instead of fleeing the scene immediately, the two individuals remained in the house to address the physical evidence and secure the financial resources necessary for their flight. A digital camera was used to document the scene, and a sum of cash, roughly several $1,000s that had been sent to the mother by charitable organizations, was removed from a safe hidden within the master bedroom. The bloody weapon was thoroughly wiped down in the kitchen sink, wrapped in standard plastic bags, and placed inside a backpack along with a change of clothes. The transition from the crime scene to the escape route involved a profound physical realization for the young woman. For the first time in her conscious memory, she walked out of the front door on her own 2 feet, completely abandoning the wheelchair that had defined her public persona. The physical sensation of the cool night air and the solid gravel of the driveway under her shoes marked the definitive boundary between her past captivity and her current status as a fugitive. The couple walked several blocks away from the house, eventually securing a local taxi service to transport them to a nearby motel, where they intended to hide before boarding a bus out of the state. The digital footprints left during the escape route would ultimately prove to be their undoing. While hiding in the motel room, an intense psychological tension began to manifest between the two fugitives. The reality of the homicide began to collide with their immature expectations of freedom in a strange, misguided attempt to provoke a police response that would lead to the discovery of the body, because the daughter could not bear the thought of her mother's remains rotting undetected in the summer heat. She accessed the shared family Facebook profile. Using the motel's unencrypted wireless network, she typed a single, highly inflammatory status update that read simply that the woman was dead. The text was stark, vulgar, and completely out of character for the profile, which had previously been used exclusively to post upbeat medical updates and expressions of gratitude to local donors. Within minutes of the text appearing online, the digital community exploded with frantic comments and shares. Friends and neighbors, assuming the account had been compromised by a malicious hacker or that the family was experiencing a severe medical emergency, began blowing up the home telephone line. When no one answered, several individuals drove directly to the Springfield residence, noting that the windows were completely dark and the family vehicle was still parked in the driveway. The absolute silence from within the house prompted a direct call to the local sheriff's department, initiating a chain of events that would rapidly dismantle the decades-long deception. The final phase of the incident block involves the physical journey away from Missouri. On the morning of June 15th, while local authorities were just beginning to secure the perimeter of the Springfield home, the couple boarded an interstate bus bound for Big Bend, Wisconsin. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was heavy with exhaustion and unspoken anxiety. The young man carried the backpack containing the cleaned weapon, while his partner sat beside him, wearing a cheap wig to alter her appearance. the physical trajectory of their flight was moving them toward a perceived sanctuary, completely unaware that the digital post sent from the motel room had already established a precise electronic coordinate for law enforcement. The illusion of a successful escape was evaporating with every mile traveled, as the automated systems of the telecommunications networks continued to log the precise movements of their mobile devices. The physical reality of the dark house on Volunteer Way in Springfield quickly drew the local community into a vortex of frantic speculation, fear, and escalating rumors. By the afternoon of June 15th, the single violent text update on the family's public social media profile had been shared hundreds of times, mutating from a localized concern into an active town-wide panic. Neighbors who had spent years watching the mother wheel her fragile daughter through the driveway stood along the perimeter of the property, swapping unverified theories about home invasions, predatory syndicates, and targeted kidnappings. The local atmosphere grew distinctly heavy, a terrifying realization that if a defenseless woman and her terminally ill, wheelchair-bound child could be violently compromised inside an exceptionally supportive neighborhood, then absolute security was a complete myth. When the local sheriff's deputies arrived at the residence to conduct a welfare check, the physical context of the property initially supported the worst public fears. The family's specially equipped van, complete with a mechanical ramp designed exclusively to lift a heavy motorized wheelchair, remained parked in the driveway, its windows covered in a thin layer of morning dust. The ramp leading to the front door was empty, and the windows of the small, pink-painted house were tightly shuttered, blocking out the bright afternoon sun. Deputies walking the perimeter knocked repeatedly on the side glass, receiving no response other than the frantic, muffled barking of the family's small terriers trapped inside. The total lack of visual or auditory activity from the occupants forced the tactical decision to initiate a forced entry through a rear window, a physical breach that immediately shifted the case from a standard missing persons inquiry into a complex homicide investigation. The interior of the house presented a jarring, clinical environment that completely contradicted the chaotic violence of the crime scene. The air was thick, stagnant, and highly concentrated with the chemical odors of prescription pharmaceuticals, antiseptic wipes, and specialized synthetic formulas. In the kitchen, neat rows of plastic medicine cups and color-coded syringes were stacked beside bottles of heavy sedatives, anti-seizure medications, and liquid nutrients. The living area was cluttered with dozens of framed photographs documenting the daughter's extensive medical history. Images of a bald, fragile girl smiling alongside major celebrities, receiving charitable awards, and posing at high-profile fundraising events. For the entry team moving down the narrow hallway, the space felt less like a conventional home and more like a highly structured, long-term care facility, a setting that emphasized the utter helplessness of the missing child. The structural path led directly to the master bedroom, where the physical indicators of the homicide were stark and absolute. The mother lay prone across the mattress, her body partially covered by the bedding, surrounded by extensive dark biological staining that had soaked deep into the fabric and the underlying foam. The defensive context was completely absent. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no overturned furniture, and no broken glass within the room, suggesting the victim had been completely incapacitated or caught entirely off guard while asleep. The initial physical assessment revealed numerous deep penetrations along the upper back and neck, wounds that had caused massive internal trauma and rapid death. The absolute stillness of the room, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic hum of an active oxygen machine in the corner, created a chilling contrast to the public image of the household. The secondary objective of the sweep immediately triggered a frantic, multi-agency search operation across the entire region. The pink motorized wheelchair, the absolute physical requirement for the daughter's mobility, was found parked neatly against the living room wall, completely undisturbed. Beside it sat her essential medical equipment, including the specialized feeding pumps, oxygen tanks, and backup battery units necessary to sustain her life for more than a few hours. For the investigators securing the scene, this single visual element was deeply alarming. A paralyzed young woman with the cognitive capacity of a small child had been removed from her life support apparatus, suggesting she had been forcibly abducted by a highly ruthless perpetrator who had absolutely no regard for her physical survival. The search operation expanded into the public sphere with extreme urgency, utilizing state and federal resources to track the movements of a suspected abductor. An Amber Alert was broadcast across Missouri and neighboring states, plastering the daughter's shaved head, oversized glasses, and clinical description across digital highway signs, television screens, and mobile phone networks. The public response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips flooded the local dispatch center, with citizens claiming to have seen a fragile girl in a wheelchair being pushed through local gas stations, rest stops, and convenience stores. Law enforcement units spent hours comforter combing local motels, checking the storage bays of long-distance buses, and tracking local taxi logs, desperately chasing red herrings generated by a panicked public that assumed the victim was entirely incapable of independent movement. The social echo of the search completely transformed the local community, creating a climate of intense paranoia and collective guilt. Neighbors who had interacted with the mother just days prior expressed profound disbelief, struggling to reconcile the horrific crime with the image of the selfless caregiver who spent every waking hour managing her daughter's deteriorating health. Rumors began to circulate that a transient criminal or a volatile collector from the mother's complicated past in Louisiana had tracked the family down to settle an old financial dispute. Volunteer search teams combed the wooded areas surrounding the neighborhood, checking drainage ditches and vacant lots, operating under the tragic assumption that they were looking for a discarded, defenseless body that could not survive without its clinical routine. The physical scale of the search grew larger with every passing hour, entirely fueled by a massive community illusion that was about to completely dissolve under the weight of digital evidence. The electronic tracing of the inflammatory digital update immediately shifted the tactical focus of the investigation from a localized physical search to a targeted digital operation. The automated logs from the social media provider recorded the exact internet protocol address utilized to access the family profile at the time the message was transmitted. Within hours, federal cybercrime specialists mapped the unique numeric identifier to a residential routing unit leased by a commercial telecommunications provider operating in Big Bend, Wisconsin. The absolute distance of the signal confirmed that the digital interface was completely detached from the crime scene in Missouri, establishing a direct electronic link to a single-family home owned by the maternal relatives of Nicholas Godejohn. The jurisdictional complexity required immediate coordination between the Greene County Sheriff's Department and local tactical units in Waukesha County. Detectives initially operated under the operational theory that the missing young woman was being held captive inside the Wisconsin residence by a highly dangerous, digitally sophisticated predator who had successfully orchestrated the cross-state abduction. A containment perimeter was quietly established around the suburban property on the morning of June 15th, utilizing unmarked surveillance vehicles to monitor the exits. The physical indicators at the scene, including the absence of any specialized medical transport vehicles or accessible ramps, suggested the occupants were completely unprepared for a long-term medical care scenario, a detail that heightened the tactical urgency for a rapid entry. The entry was executed with extreme precision by a localized weapons and tactics team, breaching the front door after a brief standoff period. The tactical sweep of the interior did not reveal a violent hostage situation or a barricaded suspect. Instead, officers encountered two individuals sitting quietly in a rear bedroom, surrounded by standard travel luggage and an assortment of unboxed digital devices. The physical condition of the young woman completely upended the foundational assumptions of the entire law enforcement apparatus. She was standing entirely unaided, moving across the room with standard physical agility, completely detached from the clinical necessity of a wheelchair, oxygen tanks, or leg braces. The high-pitched, infantile voice she had used in public was replaced by a standard adult speech pattern, a physical transformation that's signaling the total collapse of the missing person narrative. The structural search of the Wisconsin bedroom yielded a dense concentration of physical evidence that completely reconstructed the logistics of the escape. Inside a standard nylon backpack, investigators recovered a heavy, fixed-blade knife wrapped in multiple layers of protective plastic, its surface still carrying microscopic biological material that matched the victim's profile. The luggage contained several $100s in cash denominations, a collection of digital storage drives, and a cheap synthetic wig that had been utilized to alter the young woman's appearance during the interstate bus transit. The absolute lack of any prescription pharmaceuticals or specialized feeding apparatus within the personal effects confirmed that the entire medical lifestyle had been completely abandoned the moment the front door in Springfield closed. The subsequent interrogation sessions, conducted in separate interview rooms at the local precinct, exposed a deep psychological fracture between the two co-conspirators. Nicholas Godejohn initially attempted to shelter his partner from structural accountability, telling the detectives he had acted entirely under his own volition to eliminate a perceived threat. His defensive posture rapidly eroded when investigators presented the synchronized logs extracted from their mobile devices, demonstrating a highly organized, multi-year correspondence focused entirely on the planning of the homicide. The digital record exposed a systematic division of labor, proving the daughter had acted as the operational director who provided the floor plans, identified the weapon, and managed the timing, while the young man served strictly as the physical executor of the plan. The investigative breakthrough forced a comprehensive review of historical medical files across multiple states, revealing a profound systemic vulnerability within the healthcare network. Detectives traveling to Louisiana uncovered that the original hospital records from Gypsy's early childhood had been completely destroyed during the widespread flooding of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. This environmental catastrophe had inadvertently provided Dee with a clean slate, allowing her to invent a completely undocumented medical history every time she approached a new clinical facility. When a specialized pediatric neurologist in Springfield eventually grew highly suspicious of the muscular dystrophy diagnosis in 2007, noting that the girl's muscle tone was completely inconsistent with the disease and that all clinical testing yielded entirely negative results. He simply recorded his doubts in a private file, hesitant to challenge a mother who appeared so single-mindedly devoted to her daughter's survival in the wake of a national disaster. The digital reconstruction of the suspect's computer hardware revealed a highly active online footprint that exposed the true depth of her hidden autonomy. Under multiple distinct pseudonyms, the young woman had managed several secret profiles across various digital forums, interacting with dozens of individuals without her mother's knowledge. The correspondence proved she possessed a sophisticated understanding of her own physical capabilities and adult desires, completely detached from the infantile persona displayed during public fundraising events. The historical data demonstrated that the decision to employ violence was not a sudden, impulsive reaction to an immediate crisis, but the final, desperate calculation of a young adult who viewed the total elimination of her caregiver as the only viable mechanism to secure her physical independence. The legal resolution of the conspiracy began with a stark division of accountability inside the Greene County Courthouse. Medical evaluations entered into the record confirmed the historical presence of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a severe form of pathological abuse where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent to gain attention and validation. This clinical reality heavily influenced the state's prosecutorial strategy, transforming the daughter from a calculated, cold-blooded mastermind into a severely traumatized victim of lifelong torture. In July 2015, she accepted a structured plea negotiation, entering a guilty plea to second-degree murder in exchange for a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison, a resolution that many in the legal community viewed as exceptionally lenient given the brutal mechanics of the execution. The judicial trajectory for Nicholas Godejohn followed a completely different, unyielding path. His defense team attempted to argue diminished capacity, presenting psychological profiles that detailed his low cognitive functioning and total vulnerability to manipulation. The state, however, countered with the exhaustive text message archives, demonstrating a clear, premeditated intent to deploy lethal force for personal gain. In November 2018, a jury rejected the arguments of mitigation, convicting him of first-degree murder. The judge subsequently handed down a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring the physical executor of the contract would remain permanently separated from society. The empty pink wheelchair remains the enduring symbol of a case where physical captivity was dismantled only through the total destruction of a human life. The psychological architecture of the Springfield home demonstrated that the deepest horrors do not always stem from conventional neglect, but from an aggressive, pathologically distorted version of maternal care. A young woman managed to cross the boundary into the physical world on her own 2 feet. Yet the ultimate irony of her trajectory is absolute. She could only discover her true physical autonomy, her adult identity, and her release from a manufactured medical purgatory by occupying a concrete cell inside a state penitentiary. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The blue fabric of the living room sofa had completely vanished beneath layers of human waste, eroded foam, and a living body that had literally melted into the cushions over the course of 12 years. When first responders stepped into the home of a respected local politician and a church worker in the small town of Slaughter, Louisiana, they didn't find a sudden crime scene. They found a biological anomaly. A 36-year-old woman sat upright, deceased, fused to the furniture, her skin colonized by insects, while her parents slept just a few feet away in a pristine master bedroom. The core paradox of the Lacey Fletcher case lies here: how a family of pristine public reputation curated a private, agonizing torture chamber right in the center of their home. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand how a human being could vanish while sitting in the center of a family home, one must dissect the social fabric of Slaughter, Louisiana, a rural town with a population hovering around 1,000 residents. It is the type of southern community where privacy is heavily guarded, yet public reputation is meticulously curated. In this town, the Fletcher family stood as pillars of local society. Clay Fletcher worked as an influential officer for the local nonprofit historical association and maintained a prominent position within the community, while his wife, Sheila Fletcher, served as a town alderman and later worked as an assistant to the local prosecutor. They were deeply embedded in the civic, political, and religious life of East Feliciana Parish. To neighbors and churchgoers, they represented the epitome of conservative respectability, civic duty, and stable, affluent domestic life. Lacey Ellen Fletcher was born on November 25, 1985. As a young child and early teenager, she did not look like a person destined for total erasure. Accounts from those who knew her during her formative years describe a sweet, remarkably polite girl who attended a small private institution, Central Private School. She was a typical teenager in many respects. She played on the school volleyball team, had a small circle of friends, and was known for her gentle demeanor. However, beneath the surface of this ordinary adolescent life, severe psychological vulnerabilities began to manifest as she approached her mid-teens. Lacey developed a profound, debilitating form of social anxiety, which was compounded by severe autism spectrum disorder. The external world, with its unpredictable sensory inputs and social demands, became increasingly terrifying to her. By her junior year of high school, around 2001, the weight of her psychological conditions became too heavy to bear within a traditional educational environment. Her parents made the decision to pull her out of public view, transitioning her to homeschooling. This was the moment the door to the outside world began to close permanently. For a brief period, Lacey was seen occasionally around the neighborhood, walking down the long gravel driveway to retrieve the mail, her movements hesitant, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Neighbors noticed that she grew increasingly frail and withdrawn, but out of respect for the family's privacy and their high social standing, no one questioned the arrangement. The general consensus among the townspeople was that the Fletchers were simply dealing with a difficult, private medical issue with the utmost dignity. The last time Lacey was seen alive by anyone outside her immediate household was in 2002, when she was roughly 16 years old. A neighbor recalled seeing her standing in the yard, looking remarkably thin, before she vanished from the physical landscape of Slaughter entirely. From that point on, Lacey became a ghost inhabiting a living room. For the next 20 years, she did not see a doctor, a therapist, or a single peer. Her parents did not seek public assistance, medical intervention, or state aid. When acquaintances or distant relatives inquired about Lacey's well-being, Clay and Sheila would offer vague, polite non-answers, explaining that their daughter was simply high-functioning but preferred to stay indoors due to her severe anxieties. Because the Fletchers were so deeply respected, their word was absolute law. Nobody suspected that behind the neatly manicured lawn and the white siding of the family home, a slow, agonizing process of domestic containment had begun, turning a teenage girl's sanctuary into a permanent isolation cell. The psychological environment within the Fletcher home did not shift violently overnight. Rather, it crystallized into a permanent state of domestic stagnation over a span of 2 decades. When a family decides to withdraw a vulnerable individual from the structural support of society, the home undergoes a functional transformation. It stops operating as a residence and begins to function as an unregulated institution. In the case of Lacey Fletcher, the boundaries of her entire existence shrank from the parameters of the town of Slaughter to the precise dimensions of a single piece of living room furniture. The physical layout of the home became a critical factor in her prolonged confinement. The sofa was positioned in the central living area, a space that served as the literal geographic heart of the household, situated directly between the kitchen and the primary pathways to the master bedroom. This meant her presence, her deterioration, and her gradual immobility were not hidden away in a remote attic or a locked basement. They were entirely visible during the ordinary course of daily domestic life. To understand how this isolation was maintained without triggering external intervention, it is necessary to examine the specific manifestations of Lacey's diagnoses. As her severe social anxiety and autism spectrum disorder intensified during her late teens, she developed a profound condition known as locked-in syndrome, or akinetic mutism, heavily compounded by severe catatonia. This was not a sudden neurological insult, but a psychological paralysis, where the individual becomes increasingly incapable of initiating voluntary motor movement or verbal communication. Her world became entirely internal. For an individual experiencing this level of catatonic regression, any change in the immediate environment, any attempt to move them, or any pressure to interact can cause intense physical distress and panic. According to the retrospective statements provided by her parents, Lacey began to resist leaving the sofa, expressing extreme fear at the prospect of being moved to a bed or taken to a bathroom. In a standard caregiving scenario, this resistance is met with professional medical intervention, psychiatric consultation, and physical therapy. Within the Fletcher household, however, the parents chose a path of total compliance with their daughter's pathology. They allowed her fears to dictate the terms of her care, translating her psychological paralysis into a reason for physical abandonment. As the years progressed into the mid-2000s, the couch ceased to be a place where Lacey sat. It became the repository for her body. The family stopped forcing her to stand, stopped assisting her to the restroom, and stopped maintaining the basic tenets of human hygiene. This choice reflects a specific psychological phenomenon often observed in cases of extreme domestic neglect, a state of shared helplessness where the caregivers gradually normalize conditions that an outside observer would immediately recognize as horrific. The daily routine within the house settled into a surreal, compartmentalized reality. Clay and Sheila Fletcher continued to wake up each morning, prepare for their professional duties, and leave the house to engage with the public. They attended municipal meetings, managed legal files, and participated in community events, presenting a face of immaculate order to the world. Upon returning home in the evening, they stepped directly back into a living room dominated by an unfolding medical emergency. They cooked meals in a kitchen located just yards from where their daughter sat in a state of progressive physical decay. They ate, watched television, and slept while Lacey remained fixed in the exact same position on the blue fabric. This environment was characterized by an absolute absence of sound. Lacey had ceased speaking entirely, rendering her incapable of crying out for help or articulating her physical agony. The parents did not discuss the situation with anyone outside the home, creating an impenetrable wall of domestic silence. This total isolation allowed the physical conditions within the living room to deteriorate to a point that defied basic human biology. The foam within the cushions began to break down under the constant weight and the lack of airflow. The fabric became saturated with sweat, body oils, and organic waste. The lack of physical movement caused Lacey's muscles to atrophy completely, her joints freezing into a permanent, flexed position, a medical condition known as contractures. Her heels, her hips, and her spine became permanently locked into the structure of the sofa. The psychological climate in the home was not defined by active, explosive abuse, but by an indifference so absolute that it achieved the same result as deliberate torture. The parents provided her with food and water, placing meals within her reach on a small table next to the couch, but they abandoned any effort to manage the consequences of that consumption. They lived their lives around her immobility, treating her presence not as a human being in desperate need of emergency psychiatric and medical salvage, but as an unchanging, inconvenient feature of the household landscape. For 12 consecutive years, this domestic reality remained undisturbed by a single external evaluation, a single neighborly visit, or a single moment of parental panic, creating a 20-year vacuum where a young woman slowly dissolved into the furniture before the unblinking eyes of her primary caretakers. January 3rd, 2022. The temperature in East Feliciana Parish dropped to an uncharacteristic 36 degrees Fahrenheit, a sharp, biting cold that hung heavy over the small town of Slaughter. Inside the ranch-style house on Tom Drive, the heating system hummed steadily, maintaining a warm, stale atmosphere. It was a Monday morning. At approximately 2:02 a.m., a call came into the East Feliciana Parish emergency dispatch line. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheila Fletcher. Her tone was remarkably controlled, devoid of the frantic hysteria typical of medical emergencies. She informed the dispatcher that her 36-year-old daughter, Lacey, had stopped breathing. She stated that she had checked on her daughter moments prior and found her unresponsive. There was no mention of a struggle, no indication of a prolonged illness, just a flat, matter-of-fact declaration of death. The dispatch went out to local emergency medical services and the East Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Office. Because the Fletchers were well-known, influential figures, the response was rapid. First responders expected to walk into a standard, tragic scene of a family grieving the sudden passing of an ailing child. When the first paramedic stepped across the threshold of the home, however, the professional veneer of the emergency response dissolved completely. The front door opened directly into the living room. The air inside was warm, but it carried an overwhelming, suffocating stench, a dense chemical mix of rotting flesh, human excrement, and concentrated ammonia that instantly burned the nostrils and throats of the incoming officers. Several hardened deputies immediately turned back toward the porch, gasping for fresh air, their bodies reacting violently to the atmosphere. The living room was neat in some areas, containing standard household items, but the entire focus of the room was consumed by a single, standard-sized upholstered sofa. Sitting on that couch was the body of Lacey Fletcher. She was completely naked, positioned upright, but her body had sunk deep into the furniture. Over the course of 12 uninterrupted years, the physical structure of the sofa had given way under the constant weight. A deep, hollow crater had been carved out of the cushions, extending through the foam padding and down into the wooden springs of the frame. Lacey was literally sitting inside the furniture, her body wedged into a cavity filled with liquid feces, urine, and thousands of maggots. The visual reality was incomprehensible to the initial investigators. Lacey's legs were crossed tightly beneath her, tucked into the hole in the sofa. Her weight had plummeted to barely 74 pounds. Her physical form was so emaciated that every bone in her ribcage and spine was starkly visible. Her skin stretched to the absolute limit over her skeleton. Her hair was heavily matted, completely packed with dried feces and bits of deteriorated foam from the couch cushions. The decay was not a post-mortem phenomenon. It had occurred while she was still alive. Severe, deep pressure ulcers had eaten through her flesh down to the bone on her buttocks, hips, and thighs. These wounds were completely infested with living maggots and roach larvae, which were actively feeding on the necrotic tissue. The insects had colonized her body, moving through the open sores while she remained stationary, unable or unwilling to move. Her fingernails were long and filthy, packed with the same blue fabric material from the couch, indicating that at some point she had desperately clawed at the cushions beneath her. As the deputies stood frozen in the center of the living room, Clay and Sheila Fletcher stood nearby. They did not offer assistance. They did not display outbursts of grief. They stood quietly, watching the authorities document the biological disaster in the middle of their home. When asked when Lacey had last been seen alive, the parents claimed she was awake and interacting with them just 48 hours prior, on the night of January 1st. They insisted they had provided her with regular meals, leaving food on a small table directly next to the couch, and had done their absolute best to care for her under difficult circumstances. The operational reality of the room suggested an entirely different timeline. The floor surrounding the couch was stained and rotted from decades of uncleaned waste. The blue fabric of the sofa was stiff and black with dried bodily fluids. The sheer volume of insect activity indicated that Lacey had been left in a state of living decomposition for months, if not years, before her heart finally failed. The scene was so distressing that East Feliciana Parish Coroner, Dr. Ewell Bickham, was called directly to the house. Bickham had decades of experience handling homicides, structural fires, and horrific accidents, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the interior of the Fletcher residence. Upon entering the room, he described the site as a total failure of basic humanity. He noted that the victim had effectively become a physical extension of the furniture. Her skin literally fused to the synthetic fibers of the couch through the drying of open wounds and bodily fluids. The process of removing Lacey's body from the home required a specialized forensic team and hazardous materials protocols. The body could not simply be lifted onto a standard gurney. Her joints were completely locked due to severe muscle atrophy and advanced contractures. Her limbs were fixed in a permanent fetal-like position, frozen into the shape of the crater she had inhabited for over a decade. The recovery team had to carefully cut through the wooden frame and springs of the sofa to extract her body without causing further post-mortem trauma to her fragile, compromised skeletal frame. Pieces of the couch padding and fabric remained attached to her skin as she was carried out of the house. Outside, on Tom Drive, the flashing lights of the police cruisers cast long, oscillating shadows across the neighborhood. Neighbors looked out from their windows, completely unaware of the horror that had just been uncovered. For 20 years, they had assumed Lacey Fletcher was safe inside, cared for by two dedicated, loving parents who were merely protecting her from the anxieties of the world. The reality, rolling out of the driveway in a black transport van, was that the living room had served as an execution chamber, executed not with a weapon, but with an absolute, systematic withdrawal of basic human care. The immediate task fell to the investigators and the coroner's office to determine how long Lacey had lived inside that crater, how a human body could survive while being consumed by insects, and what the parents were doing while their daughter was slowly dying in the very center of their domestic life. The external examination of the 36-year-old female revealed a state of advanced chronic cachexia. At 74 pounds, the body presented an absolute depletion of adipose tissue and severe skeletal muscle atrophy. The skin, particularly across the lower torso and extremities, exhibited profound maceration, a structural breakdown of tissue resulting from continuous, long-term exposure to moisture and chemical irritants. The primary irritant was concentrated uric acid and fecal enzymes, which had eroded the epidermal and dermal layers, leading to widespread chemical dermatitis before secondary infections took hold. A critical component of the autopsy report was the mapping of the decubitus ulcerations, commonly known as bed sores. Forensic pathologists identified several stage 4 ulcers, the most severe classification, located over the bony prominences of the sacrum, the greater trochanters of the hips, and the calcaneus of the heels. These wounds were not superficial. They had breached the skin, subcutaneous fat, and muscular fascia, exposing the underlying bone structure. The margins of these ulcerations showed clear signs of chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection resulting from direct exposure to the open environment of the rotted sofa cushions. The presence of insect activity within these deep tissue cavities provided a clear indication that the victim was alive during the colonization, Pathologists collected samples of third instar Lucilia sericata, green bottlefly, larvae from the marrow cavities of the exposed pelvic bones. The developmental cycle of these specific larvae requires living or freshly necrotic tissue with active blood flow to sustain feeding. The forensic entomology report indicated that multiple generations of blowflies had completed their life cycles within the victim's open wounds, while her metabolic systems were still functioning, establishing a timeline of active insect infestation lasting at least several months prior to cardiac arrest. The internal examination provided further evidence of systemic failure. The toxicological analysis of the vitreous humor and blood samples revealed a state of severe chronic dehydration and profound electrolyte imbalance, specifically hypernatremia and hypokalemia. The gastrointestinal tract was virtually empty of nutritional substance, showing signs of advanced mucosal atrophy consistent with long-term starvation. However, the microscopic evaluation of the colon and small intestine revealed the presence of synthetic fibers, polyurethane foam particles, and fecal matter within the digestive tract. This finding indicated that in the final stages of starvation, the victim had ingested portions of the sofa's stuffing and her own waste, a phenomenon linked to terminal delirium and severe pica induced by absolute nutritional deprivation. The immediate cause of death was officially determined to be a combination of acute starvation, chronic malnutrition, and systemic sepsis secondary to the infected decubitus ulcers. The septic state was confirmed by the recovery of multiple bacterial pathogens, including Clostridium perfringens and Proteus mirabilis, from the deep tissue margins and the central bloodstream. These specific bacteria are associated with fecal contamination and anaerobic tissue destruction. The infection had entered the vascular system through the exposed bone sites, causing widespread microvascular thrombosis and multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. The forensic pathology team also focused heavily on the contractures of the skeletal system. The joints of the knees, hips, and ankles were frozen at acute angles, with the surrounding tendons and ligaments heavily shortened and fibrotic. The degree of joint fixation indicated that the victim had remained in an unchanged, semi-reclined position without any significant extension of the lower limbs for a minimum of 10 years. The cortical bone density showed advanced disuse osteoporosis, with the skeletal frame so brittle that even standard handling during the post-mortem process carried a risk of microfracture. The final report concluded that Lacey Fletcher had existed in a state of conscious, severe physical suffering for an extended period before her physiological systems collapsed. The medical data completely refuted any suggestion of a sudden, unexpected medical event on the night of January 1st. Instead, the forensic truth documented a multi-year process of slow bodily consumption, where the boundaries between a living human organism and the decaying materials of her immediate environment had been completely obliterated. The verification of the physical scene on Tom Drive required the East Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Office to systematically dismantle the narrative of domestic helplessness presented by the homeowners. Initial inquiries focused heavily on establishing the exact boundaries of parental accountability versus the victim's autonomy. Detectives initially faced a wall of defense built upon the Fletchers' impeccable civic standing and their long history of community service. In the first 48 hours, investigators treated the residence as a complicated medical scene rather than an active homicide operation, pursuing several procedural dead ends that threatened to stall the momentum of the case. The first major red herring arose from the parents' initial assertion that an external psychiatric crisis had occurred over the New Year's weekend. Clay Fletcher directed detectives toward a series of old medical documents from the late 1990s, suggesting that a specific, undocumented genetic neurological regression had manifested in Lacey during her early 30s, rendering her violently resistant to any physical contact. For 24 hours, the investigative team focused on tracking down retired local physicians and searching regional medical registries to find any record of a formal diagnosis that could legally mitigate the parents' duty of care. This search yielded absolute zero. The medical community had no record of Lacey Ellen Fletcher beyond her 16th year, establishing that no licensed physician had verified the parents' claims of her unmanageable condition for over 2 decades. A second investigative dead end emerged when a local acquaintance reported seeing a heavily wrapped figure being carried to a vehicle behind the Fletcher home 3 weeks prior to the emergency call. Detectives diverted significant manpower to analyze local traffic cameras and interview commercial drivers along Highway 61, operating under the theory that the victim had been kept at an alternate location and moved to the Tom Drive residence post-mortem to stage the scene. Forensic analysis of the soil composition inside the living room carpet and the structural settling of the sofa springs eventually crushed this hypothesis. The digital compression patterns on the couch cushions proved that the mass had been stationary in that exact coordinate for an unbroken multi-year duration. The reported vehicle movement was simply a routine property maintenance visit by a local contractor, a revelation that brought the focus of the investigation squarely back to the interior of the living room. With the alternate theories eliminated, the sheriff's office executed a comprehensive digital and physical search warrant of the property. Digital forensics units seized the personal computers, cell phones, and administrative logs belonging to both parents. Investigators were looking for any evidence of a cry for help, searches for specialized medical equipment, mobile nursing services, catatonia treatments, or institutional placement facilities. The search of the hard drives revealed an absolute void regarding medical assistance. Instead, the data logs showed a consistent, uninterrupted pattern of normal, affluent lifestyle management. Sheila Fletcher's search history was dominated by municipal calendar updates, local political coordination, and gourmet recipes, while Clay's device showed active participation in historical preservation forums and financial investments. The complete absence of any digital searches relating to wound care, infection management, or nutritional supplementation proved that the conditions in the living room were not a crisis they were struggling to manage, but a reality they had completely blocked out of their daily operations. The physical search of the house further eroded the parents' defense of loving isolation. In the kitchen, located less than 20 feet from the sofa, detectives found fully stocked refrigerators, high-end culinary tools, and an abundance of fresh provisions. The master bedroom featured high thread count linens, functional climate control, and immaculate sanitation. There was no structural breakdown of the home, no hoarding, and no financial distress that could explain the starvation of a dependent. The contrast was stark. 2 healthy, active adults were preparing balanced meals and sleeping in pristine comfort, while a human being was experiencing terminal organ failure on a rotted piece of furniture in their central living area. As details of the interior search leaked into East Feliciana Parish, the social atmosphere of slaughter underwent a dramatic, permanent shift. The initial community reaction of stunned sympathy for a prominent family quickly gave way to a pervasive, collective anger. Rumors regarding the specific details of the coroner's findings circulated through local businesses, churches, and municipal offices. The Fletchers had been fixtures at public gatherings. Their sudden transformation into suspects of an unprecedented domestic atrocity caused a profound breakdown of trust within the small town. Neighbors who had lived within line of sight of the home for decades expressed deep horror at their own compliance, realizing that their willingness to respect the family's privacy had effectively allowed a 20-year torture chamber to operate without disruption. The local Baptist church, where the family had regularly attended services, removed their names from the active rosters, and public pressure began to mount on the district attorney's office to bypass standard vehicular manslaughter charges and pursue the maximum penalties allowed under Louisiana law. The pivotal breakthrough in the investigation occurred during a formal, recorded interrogation at the sheriff's headquarters. When presented with the forensic entomology timeline and the specific bacterial cultures recovered from Lacey's bone marrow, the parents' detached composure began to fracture. Under sharp questioning from the lead detective, Clay Fletcher admitted that they had stopped attempting to clean their daughter or change her positioning around 2010. He stated that the process had become too difficult due to her vocal distress, and they had simply decided to let her remain on the cushions. Sheila Fletcher conceded that she had noticed the open ulcerations on her daughter's lower back months before her death, but had failed to contact emergency services because she feared the public exposure would compromise her position within the legal system and the town council. This admission provided the missing element of intent required by the prosecution, proving that the abandonment was not a passive failure of perception, but a deliberate, conscious decision to prioritize their social preservation over the survival of their child. The Defense Counsel initiated a series of technical maneuvers aimed at challenging the validity of the indictment, pointing to a procedural technicality in the phrasing of the initial charging documents regarding the timeframe of the alleged offense. In early 2023, a district judge threw out the initial charges due to this specific linguistic flaw, briefly halting the case and causing a wave of intense public outrage across the parish. The prosecution, however, refiled identical charges before a new grand jury within months, reestablishing the double murder indictment and pushing the case toward a definitive trial date in 2024. On February 5, 2024, facing the prospect of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, both parents agreed to a negotiated plea agreement. They officially entered pleas of no contest to reduce charges of manslaughter. During the sentencing hearing on March 20, 2024, the prosecution displayed the forensic couch evidence in open court, contrasting the physical destruction of the furniture with the comfortable lifestyle maintained by the defendants. The presiding judge issued the maximum statutory penalty allowed under the plea structure, sentencing each parent to 40 years of hard labor. The terms of the sentence stipulated that 20 years would be served dynamically within the state prison system, followed by 20 years of supervised probation upon release. Neither defendant offered a formal verbal statement or an expression of remorse during the final reading of the record, maintaining a stoic, detached silence as they were remanded into the custody of the Department of Corrections. The permanent legacy of the Tom Drive residents is not captured in the legal filings or the structural calculations of the 40-year sentences, but in the absolute silence that remains within the municipal memory of slaughter. When an institution of domestic containment operates for 2 decades in the physical center of a community, the damage to the collective trust cannot be repaired by a judicial decree. Lacey Ellen Fletcher survived for 12 consecutive years in a state of living dissolution, her presence erased from the town register while her primary caretakers maintained an unblemished public life. The couch itself was destroyed under biohazard protocols, but the core failure of communal oversight and parental indifference remains an unyielding weight on the local consciousness, proving that the most absolute horrors do not require complex conspiracies, only a total systematic withdrawal of basic human empathy behind closed doors. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. Imagine spending 20 years in a maximum security prison, branded as a calculating monster who systematically suffocated her own 4 infants, only for a microscopic strand of DNA to prove that nature, not a mother's hand, was the killer all along. For 2 decades, the justice system viewed the deaths of the Folbig children through a lens of absolute malice, converting private diaries of maternal despair into explicit confessions of murder. The core paradox of this case lies in how the law weaponized a grieving mother's self-blame to blind itself to a tragic genetic anomaly, creating one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in modern history. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the legal and scientific tragedy that swallowed Kathleen Megan Folbig's life, the narrative must pull back to long before her own children took their first shallow breaths. Long before she became a subject of national vitriol in Australia, her life was already fundamentally shaped by an act of unfathomable domestic violence. Born Kathleen Megan Donovan on June 14, 1967 in New South Wales, her entry into the world was almost immediately marked by instability, and then by blood. When Kathleen was just 18 months old, a foundational horror shattered her family structure. Her biological father, Thomas Donovan, in a fit of rage during a marital dispute, stabbed her mother, Kirsten Donovan, to death on a public street. The state machinery immediately ground into motion. Her father was arrested, convicted of murder, and sent to prison, leaving the infant Kathleen entirely untethered. For a child under the age of 2, such an entry into the child welfare system leaves an invisible yet indelible scar. a subconscious blueprint of abandonment and extreme violence. Kathleen was placed into the foster care system, moving through temporary institutional settings and foster homes, where she was exposed to the shifting, often cold realities of ward of the state life. Eventually, she found a semblance of permanence when she was placed with a foster family in Newcastle, an industrial port city north of Sydney. Those who grew up alongside her in the working-class suburbs of Newcastle described Kathleen as an outwardly ordinary, quiet girl who went to great lengths to blend into the background. She attended local schools, navigating the typical social hierarchies with a defensive emotional detachment. Her peers knew little to nothing about her biological origins. The story of the father who murdered her mother was a closely guarded secret, buried beneath a desperate desire to appear completely normal. Friends from her teenage years recalled a young woman who was fiercely protective of her domestic environment, clinging tightly to any relationship that promised stability. Psychologically, those who study the long-term impact of early childhood trauma note that children of violent offenders often carry an unvoiced toxic burden, a fear that the violence is hereditary, a genetic curse lurking within their own bloodline. Kathleen grew up under the heavy, silent weight of this legacy, attempting to construct an adult identity that was the exact opposite of her fractured childhood. By the time she reached her late teens, she left school and entered the workforce, taking on low-paying, transient, administrative, and retail jobs around the Hunter Valley region. She was searching for an anchor, an ordinary life consisting of a stable home, a reliable partner, and the nuclear family she had been violently denied as an infant. When she walked into a Newcastle hotel bar in the late 1980s, she met a man named Craig Folbig. He was a classic product of the industrial region, grounded, practical, employed as a steelworks laborer, and possessing an assertive personality that instantly appealed to Kathleen's need for a protective figure. For Kathleen, Craig represented safety, a clean break from the foster care archives and the shadows of her father's crime. Their romance was intense, rapid, and driven by a shared vision of suburban domesticity. They married in 1987 when Kathleen was just 20 years old. To the outside world, the young Folbig couple looked like the quintessential working-class success story, purchasing a modest home and preparing for the next logical step in their life plan, building a family of their own. But neither of them could have predicted that the home they were building would soon transform into a site of recurring, inexplicable grief, and that Kathleen's desperate pursuit of normalcy would lead her directly into a decades-long living nightmare. The collective human understanding of motherhood is built upon an evolutionary promise of protection, an instinctual boundary where a maternal presence serves as the ultimate shield against the hostility of the external world. When Kathleen and Craig Folbig settled into their domestic routine in the late 1980s, they were actively constructing an architecture of normalcy, a physical barrier intended to keep the traumas of the past entirely outside their walls. The purchase of their suburban home was meant to seal the narrative, providing a sterile, controlled environment for the realization of their shared domestic ambitions. Yet within this deliberate sanctuary, an invisible, algorithmic pattern of mortality began to unfold, a cyclical erosion of life that systematically dismantled the family structure from the inside out, defying the explanations of contemporary medicine. The expectation of life materialized in early 1989 with the arrival of their firstborn child, Caleb. For a brief window of 19 days, the residence operated exactly as the couple had envisioned, filled with the shifting rhythms of newborn care, the sterile scent of laundered blankets, and the soft, rhythmic sounds of infant respiration. But on the 20th night, the silence of the house transformed into an oppressive force. Kathleen checked the crib and found the child completely unresponsive, his skin cold, the life force entirely extinguished without a solitary sound or struggle to alert the sleeping parents. The emergency response units could offer nothing more than clinical formalities. The post-mortem examination yielded no anatomical anomalies, no structural defects, and no cellular evidence of trauma. The pathology department resorted to the standard medical category of the era, attributing the sudden cessation of breathing to sudden infant death syndrome, a clinical label that essentially functions as an admission of ignorance, a term used when an infant simply stops living and science cannot explain why. The trauma of the first loss did not halt the momentum of the family plan. Instead, it intensified the need to replace the emptiness left in the wake of the tragedy. In June 1990, Kathleen gave birth to their second child, a son named Patrick. The domestic space was immediately rearranged to accommodate a heightened state of surveillance, an anxious vigilance that dictated every waking hour. For 4 months, Patrick appeared to break the cycle, displaying normal developmental milestones and anchoring the parents' fragile hopes. However, the underlying vulnerability of the household reassumed control during a sudden nocturnal crisis. Craig was awakened by his wife's screams and rushed into the room to find Kathleen standing over the crib, where Patrick was locked in the grip of a massive oxygen-depriving seizure. The infant survived the immediate episode through emergency medical intervention, but the prolonged neurological trauma left him with severe, irreversible brain damage and cortical blindness. Less than 4 months later, in February 1991, a second, definitive respiratory collapse occurred while Craig was away at work. Kathleen discovered the child lifeless in his bed. The resulting autopsy noted the previous neurological injury, but ultimately failed to establish a distinct physical mechanism for the fatal event, leaving the medical community to lean heavily on the assumption of an underlying, undetected genetic or respiratory frailty. The psychological landscape of the Folbigg home shifted dramatically after Patrick's death, transforming into a space defined by unvoiced suspicions, mounting emotional isolation, and an all-encompassing exhaustion. Craig immersed himself in his employment, creating a physical and emotional distance from the domestic sphere, while Kathleen was left alone to process a double burden of grief and an encroaching sense of personal failure. Despite the fracturing foundation of the marriage, a third pregnancy occurred, resulting in the birth of Sarah in October 1992. The medical establishment, now fully aware of the family's horrific history, implemented rigorous monitoring protocols, providing the household with apnea alarms designed to sound at the slightest interruption of the infant's breathing patterns. The piercing, mechanical alert of the monitor became the primary soundtrack of the residence, a constant reminder of the thin line separating life from sudden cessation. Sarah grew past the critical thresholds that had claimed her brothers, surviving for 10 months, demonstrating a vibrant, interactive presence that briefly convinced the couple the pattern had been broken. That illusion dissolved entirely in August 1993. Kathleen walked into the bedroom in the pre-dawn hours and found the apnea monitor silent, but the child within the crib was already cyanotic. Her breathing stopped completely. The subsequent forensic analysis revealed mild airway inflammation, but nothing sufficient to cause death, forcing authorities to issue yet another ambiguous diagnosis of ESIDS, though the statistical probability of 3 successive natural infant deaths within a single family was already beginning to trigger quiet, profound skepticism among the regional medical authorities. The psychological ceiling of the Folbigg home had lowered significantly by the late 1990s, transforming the physical residence into a structure defined by unvoiced anxieties and a hyper-vigilant routine. In 1997, the couple welcomed their 4th child, Laura. This time, the protective mechanisms implemented by the medical establishment reached their absolute peak. Laura was not merely monitored, she was structurally embedded in a network of clinical safety parameters. She was placed on a cutting-edge apnea monitor that tracked her respiratory intervals, while her physical growth was continuously scrutinized by regional pediatric specialists. For 19 months, this defensive wall held perfectly. Laura proved to be the most resilient of the children, moving past the developmental milestones that had historically signaled disaster in the family line. She was walking, navigating the suburban layout of the home, and exhibiting a robust vitality that gradually eroded the thick, defensive layer of dread that had dictated Kathleen and Craig's marriage for a decade. The mechanical hum of the monitoring equipment had slowly faded into the background of daily life, replaced by the vocalizations of a thriving toddler. The collapse of this final sanctuary occurred on March 1st, 1999, a date that would permanently sever the domestic history of the family and initiate a massive legal reckoning. The day had progressed through an entirely mundane industrial cadence. The family completed their standard evening routines, and Laura was secured in her bedroom, nestled in an environment that had been verified as safe by multiple layers of medical technology. The sensory transition from evening to the deep hours of the night was abrupt. At approximately 2 a.m., the temperature in the suburban neighborhood had dropped, leaving a heavy, silent chill against the window panes. Kathleen slipped out of the master bed to check on the child, a compulsive routine developed over 10 years of systemic loss. When she pushed open the bedroom door, the mechanical silence of the room was absolute. The apnea alarm had not sounded, but the visual confirmation overrode the machinery. Laura was completely motionless, her skin displaying the distinct pale blue hue of advanced oxygen deprivation. Kathleen's physical response was instantaneous and chaotic. Her screams pierced the structural quiet of the house, slicing through the heavy sleep of her husband. Craig threw back the blankets, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards as he sprinted down the narrow hallway, guided entirely by the primal terror in his wife's voice. The scene inside the nursery was a frantic, uncoordinated struggle against time. Laura was pulled from the mattress, her small, limp frame lacking all muscular resistance. Craig dropped to his knees on the carpet, immediately initiating cardiopulmonary resuscitation, his fingers pressing into the child's chest cavity while attempting to force air into her unresponsive lungs. The tactile reality of the moment was horrific. The static friction of the carpet against his knees, the rhythmic, desperate count of compressions, and the taste of metallic, stagnant air. Kathleen was huddled against the adjacent wall, her fingers digging into her own arms, her voice a repetitive loop of panic as she dialed the emergency services. Within minutes, the suburban street was flooded with the rhythmic, flashing red and blue lights of ambulance units, casting long, frantic shadows across the ceiling of the nursery. The paramedics swarmed the small room, deploying manual resuscitators and cardiac monitoring leads, but the digital readouts remained flat. At the hospital, the formal declaration was made. Laura was dead at 19 months. The immediate medical assessment of the fourth fatality triggered a complete systemic shift within the New South Wales Forensic Department. The traditional diagnostic shield of sudden infant death syndrome had reached its logical limitation. The statistical probability of 4 separate consecutive infant deaths within a single nuclear family due to natural, unexplained causes defied the fundamental principles of epidemiology. While Kathleen was paralyzed by a profound, numb grief, internalizing the loss as a final confirmation of an inherent maternal curse, the investigative gaze shifted directly toward her. The pathology report for Laura noted signs of recent respiratory infection, but explicitly refused to certify the death as natural, leaving the cause of death officially undetermined, a clinical red flag that immediately converted a domestic tragedy into an active criminal homicide inquiry. The structural breakdown of the Folbig marriage accelerated exponentially over the subsequent weeks, driven by the weight of suspicion and emotional alienation. Craig found himself incapable of navigating the physical spaces of the home without calculating the exact locations where his entire bloodline had ceased to exist. The silence between the spouses became thick, hostile, and absolute. The definitive tipping point occurred during an afternoon when Kathleen temporarily left the residence to seek a brief respite from the suffocating environment. Craig, driven by a restless, unfocused urge to understand the mechanics of his own ruin, began sorting through the personal items stored in their shared bedroom. His search was not driven by an explicit suspicion of homicide, but rather by a desperate need to find some artifact of explanation, a medical record, a forgotten piece of correspondence, anything to clarify the logistical nightmare of the past 10 years. His hands eventually reached into the dark, stagnant space beneath the master bed, pulling out a collection of private, spiral-bound notebooks. These were Kathleen's personal diaries, a comprehensive written record spanning years of maternal isolation, repetitive trauma, and profound psychological fragmentation. Craig sat on the edge of the mattress, turning the pages in the dim afternoon light, his eyes locking onto blocks of handwritten text that caused an immediate, visceral physical reaction. The text did not contain explicit technical descriptions of suffocation, but rather a deeply ambiguous, haunting narrative of guilt, anger, and absolute despair. Kathleen had written extensively about her struggles to cope with the relentless demands of motherhood, noting that a short temper had historical consequences in her life. In one passage, she mused that Laura had left her life with a bit of help, expressing a dark belief that the child was saved from the specific fates that had claimed her siblings. The sensory experience of reading those passages altered Craig's perception of his reality in a single heartbeat. The words on the paper seemed to recontextualize 10 years of unexplained mortality, transforming a series of tragic biological failures into a calculated domestic campaign of violence. He looked at the handwriting of the woman he had lived with for over a decade and saw the profile of a serial killer. Without waiting for Kathleen's return, without confronting her about the text, Craig packed the diaries into a plastic container, walked out of the house, and drove directly to the local police command, handing the private documents over to the detectives who had been quietly compiling a case against his wife. The domestic sanctuary was completely dissolved. The diaries were now state evidence. The extraction of the spiral-bound notebooks from the domestic environment signaled the total collapse of Kathleen Folbig's private existence. When those personal items were transitioned into the custody of the New South Wales Police, they ceased to be records of internal psychological processing and became cold, hard exhibits for a criminal enterprise. The sensory transition for Kathleen was brutal, moving from the heavy, suffocating silence of a mourning household directly into the sterile, high-voltage glare of an institutional interrogation room. The social echo across the Hunter Valley region was instantaneous and deeply hostile. In working-class communities where child mortality was traditionally viewed as an act of God or a devastating biological failure, the revelation that a single mother had lost 4 infants under identical, sudden circumstances ignited an uncontrollable wave of communal fury. The local atmosphere in Newcastle transformed from neighborly sympathy to aggressive, defensive suspicion. Rumors contaminated every public space, from the local steelworks where Craig had spent his shifts to the grocery stores where Kathleen had pushed her strollers. The community felt a collective necessity to distance itself from the perceived anomaly living in its midst. The shared grief that had previously united the neighborhood dissolved into a collective demand for retributive justice. Strangers who had once offered condolences now avoided the residence, and the local press began framing the unfolding inquiry not as a medical mystery, but as the unmasking of an unprecedented domestic monster. On April 19, 2001, the systemic pressure reached its culmination. Police vehicles arrived at the property, their presence drawing the curtains of surrounding homes as neighbors watched the formal arrest materialize on the asphalt. Kathleen was taken into custody and officially charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of grievous bodily harm relating to the historical life-threatening event suffered by Patrick. The state infrastructure had firmly committed to a singular narrative. Kathleen Megan Folbig was a serial killer who had exploited the vulnerability of her own offspring behind closed doors. The psychological profile compiled by state investigators focused heavily on behavioral nonconformity. In the absence of physical trauma on the infant's remains, the detectives sought to establish a motive rooted in extreme maternal resentment and inherited psychopathy. They mapped out her daily routines, her administrative employment records, and her social interactions, hunting for indicators of a calculated duality. The public perception was systematically managed through controlled leaks of the diary contents, ensuring that before Kathleen ever stepped foot inside a courtroom, the cultural consensus had already pronounced her guilty. The human complexity of a woman trapped in a multi-generational loop of trauma was completely flattened into a simple, digestible archetype of absolute evil. For Kathleen, the physical reality of the arrest was defined by a profound, disorienting isolation. The legal system stripped her of her identity as a grieving parent and reclassified her as an institutional metric. She was moved through the administrative machinery of the corrections department, subjected to routine strip searches, and placed in protective custody due to the volatile nature of her charges within the prison hierarchy. The very society that had failed to investigate the biological vulnerabilities of her children was now perfectly organized to execute her social and legal termination. The unbroken cycle of loss had shifted from the nursery to the prison cell, and the engine of the state was running at maximum capacity to ensure she would never walk free again. The legal machinery of New South Wales stood prepared to transform a complex medical anomaly into a definitive sequence of domestic executions. When the Supreme Court of New South Wales convened in Sydney in April 2003, the physical environment of the courtroom immediately established a rigid adversarial atmosphere. The standard judicial layout, heavy timber paneling, elevated benches, and the soft, repetitive rustle of legal briefs served as the operational background for a trial that would rely entirely on circumstantial interpretation. The Crown prosecutors faced a profound evidentiary deficit. The historical forensic autopsies had failed to establish any physical proof of non-natural death. There were no petechial hemorrhages, no internal bruising of the deep neck structures, and no traces of chemical or mechanical restraint on any of the four bodies. To bridge this vast gap between suspicion and a criminal conviction, the state moved to construct a narrative scaffold built on two distinct pillars: a problematic statistical maxim known as Meadows' Law, and the highly selective weaponization of private diary entries. The prosecution launched its primary tactical assault by introducing expert medical testimony rooted in systemic probability rather than localized anatomical evidence. The core of their argument relied heavily on the logic popularized by British pediatrician Roy Meadow, who asserted that a single sudden infant death within a family constituted a tragedy. A second occurrence generated deep suspicion, and a third drop in respiration equaled murder unless proven otherwise. The state transformed this flawed psychological generalization into an absolute legal baseline. The Crown prosecutors stood before the jury box, utilizing a steady, unyielding tone to hammer home the near-impossible mathematical odds of four separate infants from the same maternal lineage dying suddenly during sleep without human intervention. The medical experts called by the state systematically discounted the historical diagnostic labels of SIDS that had been officially certified by previous pathologists. They argued that the recurring pattern itself was the crime scene. The jury was instructed to view the clinical absence of suffocation marks not as a lack of evidence, but as proof of a highly professional, clinical method of smothering that left the microscopic structures of the infant airways completely intact. The defensive perimeter established by Kathleen's legal team was structurally weak, failing to present a unified scientific alternative to the state's statistical onslaught. During the initial phases of the trial, the defense lawyers cross-examined the state's medical witnesses, attempting to highlight the logical danger of substituting mathematical probability for physical proof of guilt. They argued that rare medical phenomena do not become impossible simply because they occur sequentially. However, the science of 2003 lacked the genetic tools required to expose the deep cellular realities hidden within the children's tissues. The defense could only offer vague theories of environmental vulnerability, unmapped metabolic defects, or undetected respiratory viruses. This lack of a concrete alternative biological mechanism allowed the prosecution's narrative of maternal malice to fill the explanatory vacuum inside the courtroom. The trial reached its emotional and legal turning point when the Crown prosecutors introduced the spiral-bound diaries recovered from beneath the master bed. The prose within those journals was not evaluated by literary or psychological experts as a manifestation of extreme maternal burnout, secondary trauma, or deep-seated depression. Instead, the state presented the text as a series of literal, chronological confessions written in the immediate aftermath of homicide. The prosecution selected specific, isolated sentences, projecting them onto screens or reading them aloud with calculated pauses to maximize the emotional impact on the jury. The sensory experience inside the gallery during these readings was incredibly tense. The heavy, mechanical cadence of the prosecutor's single voice echoing through the silent room, the distinct scratch of reporters' pens, and the visible discomfort of the jurors as they listened to the internal musings of a drowning mind. The Crown heavily emphasized an entry written after Sarah's death, where Kathleen stated that a short temper had historical consequences in her life and that the child had left with a bit of help. The state stripped these phrases of their broader context, a chaotic, unedited stream of consciousness where a traumatized woman was desperately trying to make sense of a perceived genetic or spiritual curse that seemed to follow her maternal journey. The prosecutors argued that the word help could only mean the physical application of a pillow or hand over an infant's mouth. They bypassed her extensive expressions of intense love, maternal devotion, and the agonizing grief that populated the surrounding pages, focusing exclusively on her dark self-blame. Kathleen sat at the defense table, her physical posture rigid, her face displaying a numb, defensive mask as her private attempts to survive the loss of her entire family were converted into a systematic blueprint for premeditated infanticide. The prosecution's narrative successfully fused her father's historical violent crime with her own maternal struggles, creating a psychological profile of an inherently dangerous individual who lacked the fundamental evolutionary drive to protect her offspring. They suggested to the jury that the desire for control over her domestic space overrode her maternal instincts, leading to a state of lethal frustration whenever the infants disrupted the ordered routine of the household. This psychological theory, though completely unsupported by objective psychiatric evaluations or eyewitness testimony, resonated powerfully with a public that demanded a clear human explanation for an otherwise incomprehensible sequence of deaths. Following a grueling 7-week trial dominated by emotional rhetoric and statistical assumptions, the jury retired to deliberate. The institutional momentum was unstoppable. On May 21, 2003, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Kathleen Megan Folbig was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter, and 1 count of grievous bodily harm. The courtroom atmosphere during the reading of the verdict was characterized by a sharp collective intake of breath from the public gallery, contrasted against the complete, frozen silence of the defendant. The judge showed no leniency, sentencing her to a non-parole period of 30 years in prison, ensuring that she would be completely removed from society under the designation of Australia's most horrific female serial killer. The legal system had locked the door, confident that its circumstantial calculations were infallible, entirely unaware that the biological truth was quietly waiting for the technology of the future to catch up. The corrections infrastructure of New South Wales kept Kathleen Folbig hidden from public view for more than 15 years, assuming the definitive legal boundaries established in 2003 would remain undisturbed forever. But inside sterile laboratories halfway across the world, a microscopic revolution was quietly gathering momentum, completely independent of the shifting legal parameters in Sydney. The traditional understanding of sudden infant death syndrome had begun to split open under the unyielding pressure of advanced genomic sequencing. By 2018, a dedicated group of international geneticists and cardiologists looked into the historical biological materials preserved from the deceased infants, hunting for a cellular explanation that the judicial architecture had completely ignored. The structural turning point materialized when Professor Carola Vinuesa and an international team of human genome specialists extracted DNA samples from Kathleen and her deceased daughters, Sarah and Laura. The digital sequencing outputs revealed a rare inherited mutation in the CALM2 gene, an acronym representing the vital protein calmodulin, which regulates the critical calcium channels responsible for maintaining a stable, rhythmic heartbeat. This specific variant, designated as the calmodulin G114R mutation, is a known cause of sudden cardiac arrest and fatal arrhythmias in infants. The geneticists established that Sarah and Laura had not been suffocated by a malicious maternal presence. Instead, their internal cardiac rhythms had simply short-circuited due to a lethal genetic defect inherited directly from their mother. A parallel analysis of the boys, Caleb and Patrick, uncovered a distinct, separate genetic anomaly, a rare mutation in the BRPF1 gene linked to severe, life-threatening epilepsy and respiratory failure in mice, providing a clinical explanation for the massive nocturnal seizure Craig had witnessed years prior. The institutional mechanics of the state ground slowly, resisting the influx of peer-reviewed science that directly contradicted 20 years of prosecutorial assertions. A formal judicial inquiry launched in 2019 under former District Court Chief Judge Reginald Blanche initially upheld the original convictions, dismissing the emerging genomic data as insufficient to override the psychological weight of the diaries. However, the international scientific community refused to retreat. In March 2021, 90 eminent scientists, including Nobel laureates and the president of the Australian Academy of Science, signed an unprecedented petition demanding an immediate gubernatorial pardon for Kathleen, declaring that the medical evidence of natural death was now absolute. A second, exhaustive inquiry initiated in 2022 systematically dismantled the state's historical circumstantial framework. The new judicial team reviewed the diaries alongside the genetic data, concluding that the written expressions of guilt were entirely consistent with the severe self-blame experienced by mothers suffering from repetitive trauma and unvoiced postpartum depression. The scientific proof had successfully overwritten the legal fiction. On June 5, 2023, New South Wales Attorney General Michael Daly announced an unconditional pardon. After spending 7,313 consecutive days behind the wire of a maximum security enclosure, the gates of the prison swung outward, and Kathleen walked into the morning air as a legally exonerated woman. The systematic vindication of Kathleen Folbig provides no modern mechanism to restore 20 missing years of maternal mourning spent behind maximum security concrete. The final administrative actions of the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal in late 2023 formally erased the convictions. Yet the architectural layout of her reality remains permanently altered by institutional failure. Kathleen exists now within a quiet, isolating freedom, processing an agonizing paradox. She was forced to survive a hostile world that demanded her execution for a biological curse she unknowingly passed to her own offspring. The state machinery has moved on to other trials, but the visual profile of this case remains a harrowing testament to how easily collective prejudice and statistical arrogance can rewrite a family's tragedy into an artificial execution. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. Some domestic nightmares are so profoundly unnatural that they permanently shatter the collective psyche of an entire nation. In the early autumn of 2000, Australian police entered a routine suburban bungalow to find a slaughterhouse worker had transformed her partner's body into a meticulously prepared dinner intended for his own adult children. This was not a random act of insanity. It was a cold, calculated ritual of ultimate domestic vengeance. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the trajectory of Australia's most horrific domestic crime, the narrative must pull back from that blood-soaked dining room table on St. Andrews Street and look deeply into the flat, dust-choked landscape of the Hunter Valley. Long before her name became synonymous with an unprecedented level of calculated brutality, Catherine Mary Knight was shaped by a generational cycle of severe dysfunction and systemic isolation. Born on October 24, 1955, in the small, insular town of Tenterfield, New South Wales, her entry into the world was already complicated by social scandal and rigid domestic pressure. Her family dynamics were marked by extreme instability from the very beginning. Her mother, a woman who had abandoned her previous marriage and 4 children to escape severe domestic hardship, entered into a highly volatile relationship with Catherine's biological father, a man known across the local logging camps for his aggressive temperament and dependency on alcohol. The household was a claustrophobic environment where verbal threats and physical confrontations served as the primary language of problem solving. In this rural, working-class setting, conflict was not navigated through mediation. It was settled with fists and heavy, blunt instruments. Growing up alongside her twin sister and 2 older brothers, Catherine was exposed daily to the raw realities of survival in an environment entirely devoid of emotional security or structural boundaries. Neighbors from that era recalled a home where screaming matches routinely pierced the heavy valley air, and local authorities were frequently called to intervene in domestic disputes that left physical markers on both parents. As she entered adolescence, Catherine began to mirror the erratic, domineering traits of her father. She struggled significantly within the rigid structure of the local school system, showing a profound lack of interest in academic pursuits and a growing tendency toward physical intimidation. Classmates noted her intimidating physical presence and her absolute refusal to back down from any confrontation, often escalating minor schoolyard disagreements into explosive acts of aggression. By the age of 15, she permanently abandoned her formal education, seeking a landscape where her lack of academic discipline would not hinder her survival. That landscape was the local abattoir in Aberdeen, a massive industrialized slaughterhouse that served as the economic lifeblood of the entire district. It was within the high-throughput processing lines of the meatworks that Catherine truly found her calling, entering a hyper-masculine, desensitized world where death was a metric of daily production. While many workers viewed the slaughterhouse as a grueling, soul-crushing necessity to secure a paycheck, she openly thrived in the heavy, metallic stench of the killing floors. She became the first woman in the region to be granted registration as a specialized slaughterhouse worker, mastering the precise art of the skinning knives, the heavy cleavers, and the industrial bone saws. Her professional execution was terrifyingly flawless. Day after day, she stood on the concrete slates, drenched in wash water and animal residue, disassembling massive carcasses with a cold, rhythmic efficiency that deeply unnerved even her male counterparts. Coworkers frequently observed her absolute fascination with the tools of her trade. She did not leave her work at the factory gates. Instead, she began curating a personal collection of professional-grade skinning blades at home, maintaining their edges with a diamond steel sharpener until they could slice through heavy leather with a single, effortless pull. The abattoir did not create her inner darkness. It merely provided her with the perfect, clinically precise toolkit to manifest it. The volatility that defined Catherine Knight's early years didn't dissipate as she entered adulthood. It intensified, morphing into a calculated pattern of domestic terrorism that left a trail of physically and psychologically shattered men across the Hunter Valley. To understand how John Price eventually became her final victim, one must look at the terrifying blueprint established by her earlier relationships. For Catherine, domestic life was not a partnership. It was a high-stakes arena of absolute dominance, enforced through the clinical precision of her butchery tools. Her first major relationship began in the mid-1970s when she married a fellow abattoir worker named David Kelton. Almost immediately, the marriage degenerated into a claustrophobic nightmare of severe possessiveness. Catherine's control was absolute, and any perceived infraction by her husband was met with immediate, disproportionate violence. During one early dispute, she picked up a heavy frying pan and struck him across the head with enough force to shatter the handle. On another occasion, while he lay sleeping, she took a professional skinning knife from her collection and pressed the cold edge against his throat, quietly informing him that she could slice his jugular before he even had the chance to wake up. The marriage produced children, but the domestic environment remained a war zone. When the relationship finally fractured and Kelton attempted to leave, Catherine took their 2-month-old infant and placed the baby in a carriage on the local railway tracks, waiting by the side of the line for a train to approach before a horrified passerby intervened. Following the collapse of her first marriage, her behavioral patterns grew even more calculated. In the late 1980s, she focused her attention on a local miner named David Saunders. The dynamic followed the exact same trajectory. Initial intense affection rapidly giving way to severe psychological control and extreme physical outbursts. Saunders quickly learned that his wife's anger was not something that could be reasoned with. When he tried to socialize with friends outside her direct supervision, she reacted by slitting the throat of his favorite dingo pup right in front of him, using a single, clean stroke that mirrored her daily work on the killing floors. The message was clear. Anyone or anything that defied her absolute authority was subject to the rules of the slaughterhouse. The relationship ended abruptly after Catherine took a high-caliber heavy iron skillet during an argument and fractured Saunders' jaw, leaving him permanently scarred and deeply traumatized. By the time John Price crossed her path in the mid-1990s, Catherine Knight was widely known throughout the small community of Aberdeen as an incredibly dangerous, unstable force. Yet, Price, a well-liked, hard-working father of 3 who lived in a neat weatherboard home on St. Andrews Street, initially saw only a fiercely independent, capable woman who could manage a household with immense efficiency. Price was a regional manager at a local business, respected by his peers and deeply dedicated to his children. He was a gentleman, entirely unequipped for the level of pathological manipulation that was about to enter his life. The early months of their relationship presented a carefully constructed facade of domestic normalcy. Catherine moved into his home and took over the daily routines, cleaning the property and preparing meals with the same rigorous, almost military discipline she applied to her shift work. But beneath this structured surface, the machinery of control was already grinding into motion. The shift began with subtle financial manipulation. She insisted on managing his bank accounts, tracking every single dollar he spent, and systematically isolating him from his lifelong friends. The psychological erosion quickly escalated into overt physical intimidation. Price's adult children noticed a chilling shift in the household atmosphere. Their father, once an outgoing and confident man, began to walk on eggshells, constantly monitoring Catherine's mood to prevent an explosion. The domestic space became cluttered with her extensive collection of abattoir knives, which she kept meticulously sharpened and positioned in visible areas throughout the kitchen and hallway. The first major rupture occurred when Price attempted to assert his independence regarding a financial matter. Catherine responded by going to his bedroom, retrieving a hidden box containing his personal documents, and setting them on fire in the backyard. When he tried to extinguish the flames, she walked into the kitchen, picked up a heavy carving blade, and slashed it across his chest, leaving a deep gash that required immediate medical attention. Despite the bleeding, Price refused to report the incident to the police, hiding the wound beneath his work shirts out of a profound sense of shame and fear. By late 1999, the relationship had completely deteriorated into a cycle of eviction and forced reconciliation. Price would build up the courage to throw her out of the house, only for Catherine to return weeks later, using intense emotional manipulation and explicit threats to force her way back through the front door. She began telling neighbors that Price would never leave her alive, making the statement with a flat, emotionless delivery that deeply unsettled those who heard it. Price himself began to realize the gravity of his situation. He confided in his coworkers that he was terrified of going to sleep at night, constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows, because he knew that the woman sharing his bed possessed both the tools and the clinical knowledge to dismantle a human body without hesitating for a single second. The stage was completely set for a disaster that the tight-knit Valley community could never have anticipated. The tension within the weatherboard house on St. Andrews Street reached its absolute limit on the final Tuesday of February 2000. John Price had spent the entire day at his workplace, visibly exhausted and deeply preoccupied with his immediate safety. He had taken the formal step of visiting the local courthouse earlier that week to secure a restraining order, fully recognizing that his domestic situation was no longer sustainable. He confided in his supervisor that he intended to finalize his separation from Catherine Knight that very evening, explicitly requesting that if he failed to arrive for his scheduled shift the following morning, authorities should be dispatched to his residence immediately. His actions were those of a man who understood he was living alongside an active threat. Yet he returned to the property one last time to collect his belongings and secure his home. When he arrived back at the house, the atmosphere was deceptively quiet. The children were away, staying at a safe distance due to the volatile environment. Catherine was present, waiting in the shadows of the domestic space she had systematically controlled for years. There was no explosive argument upon his entry. Instead, a calculated silence hung over the rooms. Price, physically drained from the relentless psychological warfare of the preceding months, retired to the master bedroom early in the evening. He consumed a mild sleep aid to combat his chronic insomnia, turned off the bedside lamp, and fell into a deep, drug-induced sleep. He believed the heavy deadbolts on the doors would protect him for the night, completely unaware that the true danger was already inside, moving silently through the dark hallway. It was shortly after midnight when the absolute stillness of the house fractured. Catherine stood over the sleeping man, holding a heavy-duty, 12-inch abattoir skinning knife from her personal collection. The blade had been honed to a razor edge using her diamond steel sharpener earlier that evening. Without a single word or warning, she brought the weapon down into his chest with massive, rhythmic force. The first puncture wound pierced his lung, instantly flooding his respiratory tract with fluid and cutting off his ability to scream. Price woke up into a chaotic, suffocating nightmare, his body paralyzed by sleep medication and sudden, excruciating trauma. He instinctively rolled off the mattress, hitting the floorboard with a heavy thud, and attempted to crawl toward the doorway. The physical struggle that followed was exceptionally brutal, leaving a permanent forensic record across the entire layout of the house. Price was fighting for his life in absolute darkness, slipping on his own blood as he desperately tried to reach the front exit. Catherine pursued him with absolute, clinical focus, entirely unhindered by his frantic attempts to ward off the blows. She struck him repeatedly from behind, targeting his neck, his shoulders, and his torso with the exact same motion she used on the processing lines at the Aberdeen Meatworks. Blood spatters coated the floral wallpaper of the hallway, forming a trail that documented his slow, agonizing progress toward the light switch. Price managed to raise a hand to the wall, leaving a distinct smeared palm print before Catherine severed the tendons in his wrist with a precise, clean slash. He collapsed near the front door, his internal organs failing from a total of 37 deep stab wounds. The final blow penetrated his heart, bringing an immediate, chilling silence to the hallway. Price lay face down on the blood-soaked carpet. His struggle ended just steps away from the safety of the street outside. What occurred over the next 7 hours shifted the case from a standard domestic homicide into a realm of unprecedented, historical depravity. Catherine did not flee the scene, nor did she panic. Instead, the familiar environment of the slaughterhouse completely overrode her domestic reality. She transitioned seamlessly into her professional persona as a master butcher, treating her partner's remains as a standard carcass on the killing floor. She dragged the heavy body back into the hallway, positioning it beneath a sturdy doorframe. Using a specialized butcher's hook and high-tensile nylon cord, she hoisted the torso upward to allow the blood to drain efficiently onto the floorboards, a standard abattoir procedure designed to preserve meat quality. She then retrieved her full kit of industrial tools, 3 specialized skinning blades, a heavy bone saw, and a sharpening steel. With terrifyingly clinical precision, Catherine began the process of flaying the body. She made a single, continuous incision from the throat down to the groin, followed by clean circular cuts around the wrists and ankles. Her years of processing cattle allowed her to remove the entire human skin in one intact piece, completely preserving the facial features and hair. She rolled the flayed skin carefully and hung it from a prominent meat hook attached to the wooden lintel of the living room doorway, creating a gruesome curtain that brushed against anyone walking through the house. Once the flaying was complete, she utilized the industrial bone saws to decapitate the body, severing the head with a clean cut between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. She carried the head into the kitchen, placing it into a massive stainless steel boiling pot positioned on the stovetop. She filled the vessel with water, turned the gas burner to high, and added a precise selection of root vegetables, potatoes, pumpkins, and carrots, along with a measured handful of dried herbs and salt. Her intention was to create a traditional, slow-cooked meat stew. While the pot began to simmer, emitting a heavy, sweetish vapor that filled the small kitchen, Catherine returned to the hallway to harvest the prime cuts of meat from the torso. Using her finest boning knife, she sliced large parallel slabs of muscle tissue from Price's buttocks and thighs. She carried these portions to the kitchen counter, where she prepared them with meticulous domestic care. She arranged 2 matching ceramic dinner plates on the dining room table, using her finest linen placements. On each plate, she placed a substantial serving of the baked human meat, garnishing the portions with charred vegetables from the oven. Next to each setting, she positioned a handwritten note containing the first names of Price's adult children. She had constructed a formal family dinner, intended to be discovered by his children when they arrived to look for their father the following morning. The physical exertion of the butchery took several hours, requiring her to repeatedly sharpen her blades against the steel. The sound of metal scraping metal echoed through the empty house until the early hours of dawn. When the preparations were completely finalized, Catherine walked to the master bathroom, washed the animal and human residue from her arms and face, and consumed a massive dose of prescription sedatives. She walked back to the blood-stained master bedroom, climbed onto the unmade bed, and fell into a profound, unresponsive sleep, leaving the stove burner operating at full capacity beneath the boiling pot. The transition from a quiet rural night to the blinding clarity of a summer morning in the Hunter Valley usually brought the steady rhythm of shifting gears and industrial exhaust. But on March 1st, 2000, the property at St. Andrews Street resisted the morning light, remaining completely silent behind drawn, heavy curtains. The first indication that the domestic structure had completely detached from its neighborhood routine came at precisely 7:40 a.m., when a local co-worker arrived at the front gate. John Price was a man governed by absolute operational consistency. His entire professional reputation was built on arriving at his managerial station at least 20 minutes before the opening whistles blew. When his vehicle failed to appear in the staff parking lot, a collective unease immediately rippled through the administrative offices. His supervisor, recalling the specific flat warning Price had delivered less than 24 hours earlier, did not hesitate. He dispatched a senior logistics handler to the residence to physically verify his well-being. The handler parked his utility truck along the dusty curb, noting that Price's standard work vehicle was still positioned in the driveway, its metal hood completely cold to the touch. The property appeared frozen. There were no signs of morning movement, no rustle of domestic activity, and the family dog was completely absent from its usual post on the veranda. Walking up the concrete steps, the worker knocked heavily on the wooden frame of the front door, the sound echoing hollowly through the small house. There was no response, only the faint, rhythmic hiss of a high-pressure gas line operating somewhere in the rear of the structure. Peered through the side windowsill, the handler noticed a peculiar, dense condensation coating the interior glass pane of the kitchen, accompanied by a heavy, chemical sweetness that seemed to cut through the scent of the surrounding eucalyptus trees. Recognizing that the situation matched the exact parameters of the warning Price had left at the office, the worker backed down the stairs, retrieved his mobile device, and placed an urgent call directly to the Muswell Brook Police Station. The initial response from local law enforcement was categorized as a routine welfare check, a standard, low-priority dispatch to resolve a potential domestic standoff or a medical emergency. 2 junior patrol officers were assigned to the call, navigating the winding valley roads with their lights completely dark, operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a minor neighborhood dispute. They arrived at the scene at approximately 8:15 a.m., their boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel path as they approached the front entryway. The heavy sense of isolation immediately forced the officers into a state of heightened caution. They noted that while the front door was completely unlocked, the heavy brass deadbolt had been left pulled out, preventing the latch from fully seating within the iron frame. One officer extended a gloved hand, slowly pushing the door inward. The wood groaned slightly on its hinges, opening into a dim, narrow hallway that completely defied the standard layout of a residential home. The interior air was thick, humid, and held at an unnatural temperature, driven by the continuous operation of the stove burners in the adjacent room. The sensory impact was immediate, a heavy, copper-heavy smell of raw blood, combined with the overpowering aroma of cooked onions and root vegetables. The officers stopped completely on the threshold, their eyes adjusting to the deep shadows of the corridor. The floor beneath them was completely obscured. A dense, dark fluid had saturated the gray synthetic carpet, creating a reflective surface that pools around the baseboard. Smeared along the floral wallpaper were long, vertical streaks of dark red, ending in a distinct, trembling palm print located near the main light switch. The marks provided an immediate, undeniable narrative of a violent struggle that had moved from the interior rooms toward the exit. The officers drew their standard-issue service weapons, their movements slowing to a clinical crawl as they stepped into the liquid, their boots making a heavy, sticking sound with every forward progression. As they reached the junction where the hallway opened into the main living pavilion, their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating an object suspended directly from the center of the wooden door lintel. It appeared to be a heavy, pale fabric swaying gently in the thermal currents created by the open door. It took several seconds for the lead officer's brain to process the geometry of the object. It was not a curtain or a garment. It was an entire human skin, hung neatly from an industrial meat hook, its edges trimmed with the absolute precision of a commercial butcher. The face of John Price hung at eye level, completely intact, the empty eye sockets staring blankly toward the front door, while the rest of the flayed tissue draped down to within inches of the blood-soaked floorboards. The second officer completely lost his professional composure, retreating toward the open veranda to escape the claustrophobic stench of the interior. The lead investigator, operating under a state of psychological shock, forced himself to move past the flayed tissue and enter the kitchen pavilion. There, the domestic order of the household had been completely synthesized with the operational routine of an abattoir. On the kitchen counter sat 2 prepared plates, the meat arranged alongside roasted vegetables with a terrifying level of care. Next to each plate, a handwritten label identified Price's adult children as the intended consumers of the meal. On the stove, the massive stainless steel pot continued to boil, its lid rattling against the metal rim as steam carried bits of human tissue into the air. The officer turned his weapon toward the dark doorway of the master bedroom, expecting to encounter an armed suspect waiting in the darkness. Instead, he found Catherine Knight lying completely motionless beneath a stained sheet, her breathing slow and heavy, completely unresponsive to the commands echoing through the house. She had entered a deep, drug-induced coma, her body entirely relaxed in the immediate aftermath of her ritualistic violence. Within 20 minutes, the property was completely cordoned off with heavy blue forensic tape, transforming the quiet suburban street into a centralized crime scene that would fundamentally alter the cultural landscape of the entire valley. The entry of the State Crime Command Forensic Squad into the property at St. Andrews Street marked the beginning of an investigative process that quickly dissolved into deep professional frustration. In standard homicide cases, detectives are forced to hunt for hidden clues, microscopic fibers, or vanished suspects. Here, the challenge was entirely reversed. The evidence was massive, overwhelming, and presented with a terrifying lack of concealment. Yet, the initial phase of the investigation ran directly into a series of procedural dead ends and legal complexities that threatened to stall the prosecution before a formal indictment could even be drafted. The specialized team of pathologists and criminal analysts had to systematically document a crime scene that defied every established forensic protocol in the state's history. The first major hurdle for the detectives was establishing the precise chronological sequence of the physical trauma, a task made exceptionally difficult by the state of the remains. Initial field theories suggested that Catherine Knight must have operated with at least one accomplice, as the sheer physical exertion required to hoist, flay, and dismember a full-grown adult male seemed beyond the capacity of a single individual working under a strict time constraint. Investigators launched a massive secondary line of inquiry, targeting local abattoir workers and scanning Knight's recent communications for any indication of a conspiracy. They spent days analyzing neighborhood surveillance feeds and interviewing local transit workers, pursuing a prominent theory that a second slaughterhouse technician had assisted in the clean removal of the skin. This line of investigation proved to be an extensive red herring. Ballistic and physical stress models eventually demonstrated that Knight's industrial training and immense physical strength, honed by decades of lifting cattle carcasses, allowed her to complete the entire process alone, utilizing basic mechanical leverage and her specialized toolkit. The secondary dead end emerged during the evaluation of the digital and medical evidence. Crime scene analysts discovered several prescription bottles belonging to Knight scattered across the kitchen counter, suggesting that she might have acted under a state of profound involuntary intoxication or a sudden, catastrophic psychological break that would render her legally unfit to stand trial. Detectives spent weeks dissecting her medical history, interviewing regional psychiatrists, and reviewing clinic records from across New South Wales. The defense initially leaned heavily on this narrative, presenting Knight as a victim of a sudden, unpreventable psychotic episode, but the forensic pathology report directly dismantled this claim. The sheer precision of the skinning process, specifically the clean preservation of the dermal layers around the hands and neck, required an exceptional level of fine motor control and cognitive clarity. A person operating under a severe, disorienting psychotic event could not have executed cuts that matched the exact standards of a commercial meat processing facility. The investigation proved that she was entirely aware of her actions, moving from one task to the next with absolute, cold-blooded deliberation. As the technical details of the forensic report began to leak into the surrounding community, the social fabric of the Hunter Valley experienced a profound and immediate shock. Aberdeen was a town where generations of families worked side by side on the processing lines. Violence was understood in the context of the meatworks, but the synthesis of that violence with a suburban home completely shattered the local sense of security. Rumors spread rapidly through the local pubs and retail storefronts, with many residents refusing to leave their homes after dark. The neat weatherboard house on St. Andrews Street became an object of collective horror, a physical monument to a pathology that lived right next door. Local workers who had spent years sharing shifts with Knight expressed a deep retrospective terror, realizing that the cold, rhythmic efficiency they had admired on the killing floors was the exact same methodology she used to systematically dismantle her domestic partner. The psychological profile compiled by state analysts during her detention revealed a mindset entirely governed by an extreme need for punitive dominance. Knight's behavior in the weeks preceding the crime was not driven by fear or self-defense. It was a slow, deliberate preparation for an act of total ownership. When Price attempted to legalize his separation from her, he was not merely ending a relationship. He was challenging her absolute control over his existence. In her internal logic, the rules of the abattoir were the only rules that mattered. If a piece of property resisted her authority, it was to be broken down, processed, and consumed. The notes she left next to the dinner plates were the ultimate expression of this mindset, a final, permanent message to Price's lineage that her dominance extended beyond his death. The investigation successfully shifted from a chaotic search for answers into a tightly constructed, unassailable legal case, completely isolating Knight within her own pathologically documented reality. The legal culmination of the state's case against Katherine Knight began in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, where the prosecution presented an unyielding wall of forensic evidence that left no room for programmatic defense maneuvers. Recognizing the absolute futility of contesting the physical reality documented on St. Andrews Street, Knight entered a formal plea of guilty to the indictment of murder. This tactical decision bypassed a lengthy jury trial, but thrust the proceeding directly into a highly charged sentencing phase, where the judicial system was forced to calibrate a penalty for a level of domestic depravity never before codified in Australian legal history. Justice Barry O'Keefe presided over the hearing, systematically reviewing the clinical pathology records, the evidence of intense premeditation, and the psychological evaluation data that proved total cognitive awareness during the execution of the crime. The defense argued desperately for a localized term of years, citing her volatile childhood background and relational trauma. However, the state countered that her actions represented an entirely unique category of nihilistic violence, one that required the absolute, permanent removal of the individual from the social contract. On November 8, 2001, Justice O'Keefe handed down a historic determination, sentencing Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This marked the first time in Australian history that a female perpetrator received a true life sentence. Her papers permanently marked to ensure she would never again cross the threshold of a correctional facility. The justice explicitly noted that the extreme mutilation and the ritualistic preparation of the remains placed the offense beyond the boundaries of standard human conduct, rendering any future rehabilitation entirely irrelevant to the preservation of public safety. The weatherboard house on St. Andrews Street was eventually demolished, removing the physical frame of the crime from the Aberdeen landscape. Yet the structural trauma within the Hunter Valley cannot be cleared so easily. The community remains quietly haunted by the realization that a modern industrial slaughterhouse worker managed to completely superimpose her professional routine onto the sacred geography of a suburban home. John Price is remembered by his surviving children not as a forensic anomaly or a true crime footnote, but as a deeply dedicated, protective father whose evolutionary mistake was simply misjudging the sheer depth of human depravity sharing his bed. For the remaining residents of the valley, the heavy silence that settles over the hills each evening carries a permanent, gritty reminder. Some domestic structures hide an internal darkness that completely defies the boundaries of legal retribution, leaving behind ghosts that continue to speak through the generational memory of the land. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. The ultimate betrayal does not take place in a dark alley. It unfolds under the sterile glare of a hospital ward, beneath the watchful eyes of those sworn to protect the most vulnerable. In 1991, at a modest medical facility in Lincolnshire, England, an insidious predator turned a neonatal unit into a private hunting ground. Over 59 terrifying days, infants who entered the clinic with routine, treatable ailments suddenly plummeted into inexplicable, violent cardiac arrests. The killer wore a clean white uniform, spoke in a quiet, comforting whisper, and wielded a weapon so subtle it left almost no trace in the bloodstream. It took months for the medical establishment to realize that the threat wasn't a mysterious virus or a failure of equipment. It was a 22-year-old nurse named Beverly Allett who thrived on the desperate, chaotic energy of a dying child. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand how a medical facility could harbor such a threat, the timeline must reverse to the formative years of the individual who would later puzzle forensic psychiatrists. Beverly Gale Allett was born on February 29, 1968, in the rural village of Corby Glen, Lincolnshire. Growing up in a modest household as one of 4 children, with a father working as an off-license manager and a mother as a school cleaner, her early life appeared entirely unremarkable to outside observers. Neighbors recalled a seemingly ordinary girl, though those who looked closer noticed an early, intense craving for attention that manifested in highly unconventional ways. By her early teenage years, this behavior solidified into a recognizable pattern. Allett frequently appeared at school wrapped in surgical bandages or wearing heavy plaster casts on limbs that had suffered no physical trauma. She managed to convince local doctors to perform completely unnecessary medical procedures, including an appendectomy that left a permanent physical scar, but failed to satisfy her psychological needs. When medical staff grew skeptical of one symptom, she simply manufactured another. If a wound began to heal, she would intentionally tamper with it, introducing dirt or scratching at the skin to trigger a secondary infection that required an emergency return to the clinic. This pathological fixation on the sickbed naturally guided her career choice. In 1988, she enrolled in a nursing course at Grantham College. Her time in training was marked by a staggering rate of absenteeism and a reputation for erratic behavior. Instructors and peers noted her tendency to report obscure illnesses whenever tasks became demanding, frequently vanishing from shifts only to reappear as a patient in the casualty department. Her aggressive, dominant personality alienated many of her classmates. She was known to smear feces on walls in student housing, a disturbing act of vandalism that went unpunished as authorities failed to link the behavior to a deeper, more dangerous mental destabilization. Despite failing her final nursing examinations and showing a profound lack of empathy during practical assessments, the structural deficiencies of the British National Health Service in the early 1990s worked in her favor. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was facing a severe chronic staffing crisis. The neonatal unit, known as Ward 4, was desperately short of qualified personnel. Desperation led to compromise. In February 1991, without a proper background check or a thorough review of her chaotic training records, Allett was hired on a temporary 6-month contract. She was placed in a position of absolute authority over vulnerable infants, working shifts where she was frequently left unsupervised. The hospital administration saw her as a pair of hands to fill a gap in the schedule. They completely ignored the fact that her physical and psychological unfitness had been fully documented by her instructors. The stage was set. The sterile environment became her domain, and the machinery of the hospital was about to be weaponized against the very people it was designed to heal. The environment of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in the early spring of 1991 was defined by a quiet, systemic desperation. The National Health Service was buckling under fiscal constraints, and Ward 4, the dedicated pediatric and neonatal unit, bore the brunt of these structural failures. It was a confined, high-pressure space containing just 13 beds, meant to serve as a sanctuary for the town's youngest residents. Instead, it became an understaffed bottleneck where a single pair of extra hands was welcomed without scrutiny. The physical layout of the ward was a maze of linoleum corridors, glass partitions, and stainless steel cribs. The air smelled permanently of industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and sour infant formula. On any given night, the background track of the unit was a chaotic symphony of monitor alarms, the rhythmic hum of oxygen concentrators, and the thin, reedy crying of distressed newborns. Because the hospital could not attract fully qualified, registered pediatric nurses to this rural outpost, the day-to-day operations relied heavily on state-enrolled nurses and temporary staff who lacked specialized training in advanced infant care. When the 22-year-old clinic trainee entered this delicate ecosystem, she did not raise alarms. To her colleagues, she appeared remarkably eager to please, volunteering for the highly unpopular, grueling night shifts that older, more experienced nurses actively avoided. She was a stocky, plain-faced woman who blended seamlessly into the background of a busy clinical rotation. Her uniform was always immaculately pressed, her demeanor soft and non-threatening. Parents who brought their sick children to Ward 4 initially found her presence reassuring. She possessed a quiet, almost maternal attentiveness that stood out in a ward where the permanent staff was visibly exhausted and chronically rushed. The administrative oversight within the hospital was astonishingly lax. Because the clinical coordinator was overwhelmed by shifting schedules and budget deficits, basic procedural safeguards were completely ignored. No one verified her practical evaluations from nursing school. No one questioned her high absenteeism during her training period. She was granted unrestricted, unmonitored access to the drug lockups, the treatment rooms, and the patient charts. In a ward where 2 nurses were frequently left to manage a dozen unstable infants simultaneously, independence was not just encouraged, it was mandatory. The young nurse quickly established herself as a fixture in the neonatal unit, developing a peculiar affinity for the most vulnerable patients, those admitted with minor respiratory infections, mild gastroenteritis, or routine postnatal observation. She would sit by the incubators for hours, leaning over the plexiglass shields, her face reflected in the green light of the heart rate monitors. Her fellow nurses began to rely on her willingness to take over feeding schedules and medication administrations, grateful for the respite. They viewed her as a dedicated, if somewhat detached, colleague who simply wanted to gain experience in pediatric care. Parents, too, were drawn into this illusion of competence. When infants became distressed, she was often the first to arrive at the bedside, speaking in low, rhythmic tones that seemed designed to soothe the anxious adults as much as the child. She learned the specific routines of the ward with terrifying speed, knowing precisely when the ward doctors conducted their rounds, which hallways remained unmonitored by senior staff during the early hours of the morning, and how to silence the telemetry alarms without triggering a central nursing station alert. The power dynamic within Ward 4 was subtly but fundamentally altered. The understaffed unit became entirely reliant on a temporary worker whose clinical ignorance was masked by a frantic, self-sacrificing workload. She became the gatekeeper of the night shift, a quiet presence moving between the rows of cribs in the dim, blue-hued light of the nursery, holding the lives of the town's children in her hands, while her colleagues filled out paperwork in the distant front office. The stage was entirely set. The instruments of life-saving intervention, the syringes, the intravenous lines, the concentrated vials of electrolytes stored on the open shelves of the treatment room, were now under the sole control of an individual who viewed the ward not as a place of healing, but as a theater for her own dark psychological needs. The fragile stability of Ward 4 fractured completely on February 21, 1991. Liam Taylor, a 7-week-old infant, had been admitted to the unit suffering from a routine bout of chestiness, a standard respiratory syncytial virus infection that typically required nothing more than minor oxygen support and basic monitoring. His prognosis was excellent. His parents had been reassured by the clinical staff that their son would likely be discharged within a few days. The infant was resting in a sterile plexiglass cot, his breathing shallow but steady. Then, the temporary trainee took over the sole management of his cubicle. Within 20 minutes of her entering the room alone, the telemetry monitors exploded into a frantic, high-pitched whine. The infant's respiratory rate plummeted, his face twisted into a dark, suffocating shade of blue. When the emergency resuscitation team burst through the double doors, they found the trainee standing calmly over the cot, watching the child convulse. The medical staff worked frantically to restore the baby's breathing, pumping air into his tiny lungs and administering standard emergency stimulants. They managed to stabilize him, but the suddenness of the event left the attending pediatricians deeply unsettled. There was no physiological framework to explain why a child recovering so well from a basic chest infection would experience an instantaneous, catastrophic respiratory failure. The nightmare was not an isolated event. It was a calculated pattern beginning its run. The infant suffered a second, far more severe collapse just hours later. This time, his heart stopped entirely. The monitor screen flattened into a solid, unmoving line. The air in the small room grew thick with the smell of sweat and adrenaline as doctors performed chest compressions with their fingertips, trying to force a microscopic heart back into rhythm. They succeeded a second time, but the damage was irreversible. The profound lack of oxygen had devastated the child's brain tissue. He was rushed to a specialized intensive care facility in Nottingham, but his body finally gave up the fight. He died without a clear diagnosis, leaving a devastated family and a clinical chart that baffled the consulting physicians. Before the ward could even process the trauma of the first infant's death, the predator chose her second target. Timothy Hardwick was an 11-year-old boy with severe cerebral palsy. He had been admitted to Ward 4 on March 5th following an epileptic seizure. The fit had ended, his condition was stable, and he was fully conscious, resting quietly in his bed. The trainee was assigned to monitor his recovery and check his vital signs at regular intervals. Shortly after she walked into his room to take a routine blood pressure reading, the emergency alarms triggered again. The boy's heart rate spiked violently before crashing to zero. Doctors ran down the corridor, their rubber-soled shoes slapping against the linoleum. They found the trainee in the room, her expression entirely neutral as she informed them that the patient had suddenly stopped breathing. For over 40 minutes, the resuscitation team injected adrenaline, delivered shocks, and massaged the boy's chest. Their efforts were useless. He was pronounced dead in the middle of the afternoon. Because of his pre-existing neurological condition, the sudden cardiac arrest was tragic, but it was ultimately written off as an unavoidable complication of his severe epilepsy. No one looked at the nurse who had been the last person to touch him. The interval between strikes began to compress as the psychological payoff for the perpetrator intensified. On March 10th, a much younger target was brought into the unit. Kaylee Desmond was a healthy, robust 5-month-old infant who had been admitted purely for observation following a minor chest issue. She was active, feeding well, and showing every sign of a rapid discharge. The trainee took an active interest in the case, volunteering to handle her feeding routine and sit by her cot during the quiet hours of the afternoon shift. Suddenly, while the child's mother was standing just feet away in the corridor, the infant went rigid. Her skin turned a ghastly, mottled gray, and her eyes rolled back into her skull. The mother screamed for help. The trainee appeared from behind the privacy curtain, casually holding the infant in her arms, claiming the baby seemed to be having a slight fit. The resuscitation team intervened immediately, injecting drugs to counter the massive cardiac depression. The infant's life hung by a thread for hours, her blood pressure dropping to dangerous levels before she was stabilized enough to be transferred out of Grantham entirely. She survived, but her recovery was a medical anomaly that standard pediatric textbooks could not clarify. The terror peaked on April 3rd with the arrival of the Phillips twins, Katie and Becky. Born prematurely but completely healthy, they had been kept in the neonatal unit for routine observation to ensure their weight gain remained on track. Becky, a tiny infant weighing just a few pounds, was the first to face the needle. While under the sole care of the night nurse, she entered a state of violent, inexplicable convulsions. Her blood sugar levels plummeted to near zero, a state of hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia that should have been impossible in a child who had just been fed. Doctors fought for an hour to bring her back, but her tiny body had been pushed past its limit. She died in the early hours of the morning. The cause of death was recorded as natural causes, specifically a suspected case of sudden infant death syndrome. The family was left to grieve their daughter, completely unaware that the killer was already preparing to strike her twin sister. 2 weeks later, on April 16th, Katie Phillips was brought back to the hospital by her terrified parents, who feared she might suffer the same fate as her late twin. The hospital administration, wanting to provide comfort, placed the child back on Ward 4 and assigned the exact same trainee to keep a close watch over her. Within hours of her admission, Katie stopped breathing. Her heart rate collapsed into a flatline. The medical team rushed in, managing to restore her pulse, but over the next 24 hours, the infant suffered 3 more identical, unprompted cardiac arrests. Each time, the trainee was the one who discovered the collapse and raised the alarm. The child survived the onslaught, but the sustained lack of oxygen left her permanently blind, deaf, and quadriplegic, her brain severely damaged by the mysterious forces operating within the ward. The final strike occurred on April 22nd. 15-month-old Claire Peck was admitted with a minor attack of asthma, a routine respiratory issue that required a simple nebulizer treatment. The child was laughing and playing with her toys in the afternoon. The trainee was left alone with her to administer the respiratory medication. 10 minutes later, the nebulizer was found running on an empty cot as the child lay blue, cold, and entirely pulseless on the mattress. The resuscitation team managed to restart her heart twice, but during a third massive collapse later that evening, her body could no longer fight. She passed away at 9 p.m. The death of a healthy toddler from a minor, easily managed asthma attack was the absolute breaking point for the clinical staff. The sheer volume of sudden, unexplained flatlines within a single tiny unit had completely broken the laws of medical probability. The death of Claire Peck shattered the collective composure of the clinical staff on Ward 4. Up to this point, the administrative leadership of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital had treated the soaring mortality rates as a statistical anomaly. An unfortunate run of severe, rapidly progressing respiratory viruses targeting the community's children. Pediatric consultant Dr. Nelson Porter could no longer accept that explanation. The baseline reality of clinical probability had been completely violated. Children admitted with highly treatable, standard conditions were dropping into flatlines within minutes of their parents leaving the room. The hospital was rapidly changing from a place of recovery into an unexplained slaughterhouse. The initial internal search for answers began in complete secrecy. The administration desperately wanted to avoid public hysteria or a full-scale media panic that would destroy the medical center's reputation. Dr. Porter began reviewing the clinical charts of every child who had collapsed or died over the preceding 8 weeks. He laid the paperwork across his desk, looking for a common biological denominator. He checked the medical batches of the antibiotics, examined the oxygen supply lines for systemic contamination, and cross-referenced the maintenance logs of the telemetry monitors. Everything came back clean. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The medications were sterile. Then, the focus shifted from the instruments to the human schedule. Dr. Porter constructed a timeline matrix, logging the exact minute of every sudden collapse alongside the staff roster. A pattern emerged from the columns of names. One specific individual was always present. Out of 26 separate life-threatening emergencies on the tiny unit, the 22-year-old temporary trainee had been the primary nurse assigned to the infant or the first person to enter the cubicle and discover the crisis every single time. When she was off duty or assigned to administrative filing, Ward 4 was completely quiet. The moment her name appeared on the shift log, the resuscitation alarms triggered. On April 30th, 1991, the hospital administration officially contacted the Lincolnshire Police. The presentation to the detectives was hesitant. The hospital could not definitively prove a crime had been committed. They only knew that children were dying at a rate that defied nature. Chief Superintendent Stuart Clifton took charge of the operation, establishing a secure incident room away from the main station to prevent leaks to the press. The first phase of the external search was not for physical evidence, but for documentation. The police demanded the immediate surrender of all ward logbooks, staff duty charts, and patient medical files spanning the 59-day period. A critical roadblock emerged almost immediately, halting the investigation's momentum. When detectives attempted to cross-reference the pharmacy logs with the patient charts, they discovered that the daily nursing logs for the specific dates of the collapses were completely missing. Several pages had been cleanly torn from the central binder in the staff office. The hospital's internal security had no record of who had accessed the files or when they had vanished. This targeted destruction of evidence transformed the police's perspective. They were no longer looking at a potential case of medical negligence or an undiagnosed hospital infection. They were hunting a calculated internal saboteur who knew exactly how to dismantle the paper trail. As news of a police presence at the hospital slowly leaked into the surrounding town, the social echo was instantaneous and severe. Grantham was a tight-knit, traditional community where generational families relied heavily on the local facility. Within 48 hours, rumors began ripping through the streets. Fear completely paralyzed the local parents. Mothers refused to bring their children to the outpatient clinics. Parents of infants currently admitted to other wards demanded immediate discharges, packing their belongings into cars in the middle of the night, rather than leaving their children exposed to an unseen killer. The local telephone exchange was jammed with hundreds of panicked calls from families demanding to know if their children's prior hospital visits were part of the investigation. The atmosphere inside the hospital became toxic with mutual suspicion. The police began conducting highly targeted, aggressive searches of the personal lockers, vehicles, and residences of the entire pediatric nursing staff. Detectives tore through personal bags, confiscated diaries, and analyzed financial records, looking for any indication of a motive. The trainee remained remarkably unbothered by the scrutiny. While her colleagues wept in the break rooms and struggled to look each other in the eye, she chatted casually with the investigators, offering them tea and expressing an almost detached curiosity about the progress of the case. The definitive breakthrough in the search for physical proof occurred not in Grantham, but in the forensic laboratories of the University of Sheffield. Dr. Porter had managed to preserve blood samples from several of the surviving infants, including the twin girl who had suffered brain damage. The results of the toxicology screens were delivered to Superintendent Clifton's desk in early May. The data was indisputable. The blood of the infants contained astronomical levels of exogenous insulin, concentrations that could only be achieved through massive, deliberate injections of the hormone into the patient's intravenous lines. The search had found its weapon. The killer was actively inducing insulin shock to trigger fatal cardiac arrests, leaving the doctors to chase natural explanations while she watched the chaos unfold. The arrival of the Sheffield toxicology report completely altered the mechanical rhythm of the inquiry. Superintendent Clifton now held definitive proof that a biological weapon had been deployed inside the hospital, but translating chemical data into a legal case required a meticulous deconstruction of the ward's daily procedures. The detectives faced a complex challenge, proving that the trainee, out of all the clinical staff, was the sole individual who had both the opportunity and the specific motive to deliver the lethal doses. The initial phase of the interrogation process was defined by a series of significant dead ends. Investigators spent weeks pursuing the possibility of a manufacturing defect in the hospital's bulk supply of intravenous solutions. Detectives tracked down the production lot numbers for every single saline bag used in the ward during the 59-day period, sending investigators to the production facilities in the Midlands. Chemical analysts spent days testing control samples for traces of bacterial contamination or chemical imbalances that could cause sudden cardiac depression in newborns. The results were entirely negative. The manufacturing process was flawlessly sterile, eliminating the possibility of an accidental systemic failure. A second, more frustrating red herring emerged when a senior medical administrator suggested that a localized outbreak of an unidentified fast-acting enterovirus might be responsible for the sudden collapses. The hospital's clinical data records showed a minor spike in adult gastric admissions in the broader Lincolnshire area during the winter months. Forensic teams traveled across the country, consulting with specialized epidemiological units in London to map the potential transmission vectors within the facility. The theory completely collapsed under closer analysis. Enteroviruses do not cause instantaneous, near-zero drops in blood sugar levels, nor do they selectively strike only when a specific temporary nurse is standing beside the incubator. The medical jargon was exposed as an administrative shield, an attempt to normalize a series of homicides under the guise of an unpredictable natural event. As these initial leads vanished, the focus of the digital and physical surveillance converged entirely on the trainee's terraced house in Corby Glen. A compliance warrant allowed detectives to seize her personal diaries, childhood scrapbooks, and correspondence. The material unspooled a bizarre, insatiable psychological landscape. The pages were filled with detailed logs of her own fabricated medical symptoms, records of her self-inflicted injuries, and photocopies of letters she had written to various doctors demanding specialized testing for rare blood conditions. More alarming was the discovery of dozens of official hospital nursing charts stashed under her mattress, the exact paper records that had vanished from the files at Grantham. The legal breakthrough required a massive, cross-reference documentation matrix. Investigators filled the walls of the incident room with massive tracking boards, plotting every single minute of the 59-day period. They logged the exact time of medication deliveries, the feeding schedules, the shift handovers, and the breaks for every employee. The data was subjected to an unyielding mathematical filter. The probability of any single nurse being randomly present at 26 separate, unrelated cardiac flatlines was statistically impossible. The data pinpointed a single, terrifying overlap. The trainee had been the only person with physical access to the infant's intravenous ports during the critical 10-minute window preceding every single collapse. When Clifton brought the young nurse into the formal interview room for her first extended interrogation, the behavioral contrast was striking. The room was cold, smelling of stale instant coffee and damp coats. The detective leaned forward, laying out the massive toxicology charts and the stolen medical logs on the table. He explicitly detailed the chemical evidence of exogenous insulin and the fatal concentrations of potassium chloride found in the tissue samples. The suspect sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her voice was remarkably steady, completely devoid of the emotional strain typically seen in suspects facing multiple murder charges. She did not offer angry denials or elaborate alibis. Instead, she adopted a strategy of total administrative detachment. She told the investigators she simply could not remember the specific events of those nights, stating that the ward was always chaotic and that she was merely performing her basic clinical duties as instructed by the senior staff. When shown the stolen charts found under her bed, she claimed she had taken them home merely to study the complex cases and improve her nursing skills, showing no remorse for the families whose children had died while under her care. The psychological profile compiled by the behavioral analysis units during the active investigation revealed the hidden logic behind the crimes. The trainee was not operating under a typical sadistic impulse. She was suffering from an extreme, malignant manifestation of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. She viewed the infants not as living beings, but as chemical instruments to manipulate her social environment. By inducing a life-threatening crisis, she instantly transformed the sterile, routine atmosphere of the ward into a high-stakes drama where she could play a central role. She craved the frantic adrenaline of the resuscitation effort, the panicked arrival of the doctors, and the subsequent praise she received for being the vigilant nurse who noticed the infant's initial distress. The deaths of the children were merely the acceptable structural waste of her pathological need for attention. By late May, the forensic evidence locked into place. The police possessed the toxicology data, the stolen medical records, the statistical proof of exclusive opportunity, and the psychological framework to explain the anomalies. The temporary contract that had allowed a predator access to the town's most vulnerable residents had finally been dismantled by an unyielding forensic net. The scientific evidence crushed any remaining structural cover for Beverly Allitt. In October 1991, formal charges were locked in, forcing a direct confrontation in the courtroom. The trial commenced at Nottingham Crown Court in early 1993, transforming a localized medical failure into a national legal reckoning. Throughout the grueling months of testimony, the defendant sat in the dock, showing a calculated, chilling detachment. She had shed a massive amount of weight, an apparent physical manifestation of her psychological crisis. Yet her face remained entirely expressionless as prosecutors detailed the deliberate chemical destruction of the infants. The defense attempted to establish a framework of profound mental instability, but clinical experts countered with a definitive diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, proving her actions were fully conscious, precisely timed interventions designed to extract attention from the clinical chaos. The jury deliberated for nearly 40 hours before returning a definitive verdict. Allitt was convicted on 13 counts, including murder, attempted murder, and causing grievous bodily harm. The judge delivered a crushing sentence, 13 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, emphasizing that her position of sacred trust had been transformed into an instrument of absolute malice. The courtroom remained entirely silent as she was led away, her destination fixed at the high-security Rampton Secure Hospital, where she would remain indefinitely under permanent psychiatric lock. The true horror of Ward 4 did not evaporate with the judicial verdict. The tiny community of Grantham was left to look inward, forced to rebuild a fundamental societal contract that had been utterly pulverized from within. The local hospital suffered an immediate, near-fatal loss of public trust, its empty pediatrics department serving as a stark physical monument to a collective failure of institutional vigilance. Local parents would spend the next several decades watching their surviving children cope with severe, lifelong neurological deficits, a permanent physical echo of an intervention that was supposed to offer healing. The machinery of care had been fundamentally compromised, transformed for 59 days into a highly efficient delivery system for an insatiable, localized malice. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.